also find a lot on this particular lecture, which is the Eastern and Home Front. Probably those of you who know a little bit about Nazi Germany is that when one talks about the war, especially in the United States of America, one tends to not talk so much about the Eastern Front. I mean, there's of course much about the American involvement. You see, for instance, there's a lot of emphasis on the Italian front, the African front, especially a lot on, June 6, 1944, the Normandy landing, and of course the Battle of the Bulge. So there's a lot of emphasis on this. And that sometimes gives a little bit of skewed picture, especially when you consider the casualty rate. I mean, clearly there was terrible fighting in France and Italy, but if you consider the casualty rates of the North African campaign of Italy, France, and so forth, and you compare this with the Eastern Front, it's a mere fraction. Just to give you a couple of examples, it's estimated about 55 million people died in World War II. Of those 55 million people, about 20 to 25 million were Soviet citizens. Just to show you. And then, of course, also when you're looking at the casualty rates of the Germans, whether they're fighting in Italy on the west, and you compare it with the east, the rate is something 10 to 1. Okay, incredible bloodletting on the Eastern Front. And this lecture also talks about why that is. It was a very different war. To call it a dirty war is probably downplaying it. It's certainly a war that was informed by ideology, by racial ideology. And this, of course, will connect to Dr. Volken's lecture on Nazi racial categorization. So this is a war also that allows us to show how propaganda operates within Nazi Germany. It's also a war that had very close connection with the home front, with what was happening in Germany at home, and also the shift from Hitler giving most of the speeches to the importance of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. Or I should say, one of my favorite titles is the Minister of Enlightenment and Propaganda. I'm not sure those two go together, but the Nazis used that type of phrase. So let me get started then on this. Dr. Volken said we have to be honest where we get our sources from. Here are two books that inspired my particular lecture. Especially this one is a bit controversial. It's written by a historian who is at Rutgers University, I believe, in New Jersey. His name is Omar Bartov. And the reason why I'm saying he's somewhat controversial is people in Germany don't like him very much because he doesn't have a good view of the common German soldier. And when you're looking at the title of his book, Eastern Front, 1941 to 1945, German troops and the barbarization of warfare. That kind of says it all. Namely that warfare is always evil, bad, has casualties, but what you would see on the Eastern Front is certainly something that is unprecedented in terms of the casualties, in terms of the sort of distinction between combatants and civilians, the treatment of POWs, especially by the Germans initially, but then of course also by the Russians. This is something that, it has happened again, but at the scale that you have on the Western Front is clearly unprecedented. Another book, it's called The War of Annihilation. If you're interested in that, I believe Dr. Volken has a copy of this particular book. Mm-hmm. I believe we have a copy of this book in the library, so if you're interested in those. This one is only deals with the initial campaign, the 1941 campaign, but it's also, again, the sort of notion here is that this is not a normal war, but this is a war where you basically take no prisoners, or if you take prisoners, you will kill them, starve them systematically. And what both of these books connect, they have their differences, their military histories, so in some ways not always the easiest of readings, but where they both connect is this poster right here. der Untermensch, which means the subhuman. And that is how the Nazis saw everybody in the East, pretty much, especially the citizens of the Soviet Union. And we'll talk about this because to some extent there are some historians that often say that the Nazis missed a golden opportunity in the so-called bloodlands that Dr. Vulcan mentioned earlier. Those are the border regions between the Soviet Union and what is today Poland. These are countries such as Belarus, the Ukraine, the Baltic Republic. There wasn't much love lost for Stalin and the Soviets. But since the Germans kind of came in with the attitude that everybody living there was equal, there was a big opportunity lost, and I'm going to talk more about that as well. So, before telling you something, I mean, one thing we haven't done, and that's partially because of the summer. Usually Dr. Vulcan will tell you a lot about the campaign in the West. He would talk about what happened between the years of 1939 and 1941.
Yeah, I think those slides are on Blackboard somewhere, so
Yeah.
if you want to read through that, it's in your book as well, but if
It's
you
in-
want to look through the slides, those are in there somewhere.
So we're kind of skipping over that, and that's partially also because, again, as a German, there's that sort of danger of glorifying what happened between 1939 and 1941 as the sort of a victorious march of Germany into all of these countries, and I don't want to give that impression. Okay, so, but what you have until 1941 is that most of Europe is either under direct Nazi control or allied with Nazi Germany. There's a couple of neutral countries, and we've already mentioned that. There's Spain. One of the reasons why Spain did not involve itself in the country is because in this conflict is because they had a major civil war between 1936 and 1939, which pretty much drained their resources. So that's why they would send troops to the Eastern Front. I'm going to talk briefly about that. There will be the so-called Blue Division, which is a detachment of Spaniards that were fighting in the East until about 1943. Then they kind of saw the writing on the wall and pulled out. The areas that you see shaded, the original is yellow, but it doesn't come out that well. All of this is, of course, Nazi controlled. This is Nazi-controlled France. Notice that the Germans have occupied all the Atlantic coast of France, and that is partially due because here you will find the very dreaded U-boat bases, you know, where the Nazis would launch their submarines into the Atlantic. And also over here you would find, of course, airfields that the Nazis would use to bombard the United Kingdom. Of course, the Netherlands, Belgium is occupied, Denmark is occupied, Norway is occupied, Finland will be an ally, Hungary will be an ally. Ultimately, the Germans would invade Yugoslavia and Greece, so they would occupy those as well. Romania was an ally, Bulgaria was an ally, Turkey was on the sidelines. I mean, after all, the Ottoman Empire was an ally of Germany in World War I, but during the Second World War, they kind of were on the sidelines until the very end of the war, where they entered on the side of the Allies. Then, of course, you have two major important neutral countries. We already talked about that. Switzerland. Switzerland was very important because that's where many of the American companies had set up their seat, and that was partially so they could still do business despite the United States being in the conflict. Another important neutral country is Sweden. That's where Germany got a lot of its resources from, especially iron ore. That's why also they occupied Norway, because there was an important railway line leading to the very north of Norway, connecting it with the Swedish iron ore. So one of the reasons why the Nazis would invade Norway is to secure this access to the vital resource. Another support that Spain gave to the Nazis was Spain had a lot of very strategic resources, in particular tin, That was very important in the production of the military industry, so Spain would also supply this stuff to Germany. Last week I told you how important the Soviet Union was, and that really after 1940 the Soviet Union would become one of the major exporter into Germany, partially because of an agreement that the Soviet Union had signed with Nazi Germany that ultimately led to the partition of Poland in 1939. There was the Nazi-occupied Poland, which is known as the General Government, that is located over here, and the Soviet Union took over most of what is the eastern part of Poland. So as we move into 1941, Germany and the Soviet Union really had a common border. I mean, when we talk about the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany didn't have to roll to any sort of neutral country, but Germany and the Soviet Union had a continuous border. So, and this border really stretched from the Black Sea, because a lot of the allies that joined into the conflict. Romania, Bulgaria would also supply troops, as well as Finland. So you basically had a continuous border that would run for several thousand miles until the Baltic Sea.
Wouldn't Japan like ally up with the
There was the Tripartite Pact was signed in 1940. I believe it was signed in definitely 1940. And it was a sort of, it wasn't so much of a military pact as it was an understanding that Italy and Germany would take over Europe, while the Italians and the Germans would give the Japanese free hand in Asia. So it was a sort of devising your own sphere of influences. That was also something that the Japanese would invoke, because of course the Nazis were very much hoping that instead of hitting Pearl Harbor, the Japanese would hit Siberia, because that would have taken the pressure off. And we'll talk about this, because when we see one of the major offensive that happens in the winter of 1941 will be done by Siberian troops. Because Stalin had a spy sitting in Japan that knew very well that Japan was going to hit Pearl Harbor. And Japan, of course, their argument was that they could then strike to occupy strategic resources, most importantly the rich oil countries of Malaysia and Indonesia. So that was their game. But the Tripartite Pact allowed them to do this. I mean, Hitler wasn't really happy about this. He would have rather have the Japanese strike towards the Soviet Union, but that was the way. All right, so yes, Japan is in the conflict, and this is very important. We always tend to think that World War II starts on September 1st, 1939. That is just a European theory, because Japan has been in the conflict. I mean, people keep moving it further and further back. Some people argue that World War II started with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. And some people, of course, say that the shooting war in the Pacific really starts around the same time, in the mid-1930s, with, after 1937, China and Japan being officially in the war. So the war is already going on as Germany prepares to invade Poland. So that's why they have to come to some sort of agreement, because they don't want to ultimately meet each other. So, yeah. So this is what it looks like, June 1941. And this is another interesting thing. After the fall of France, Hitler's approval rate was probably around 80 to 90% among the Germans. And there's reason for this. Even people who opposed Hitler believed that he was some sort of genius, that he managed to conquer France in 6 weeks, something the Germans had failed to do in 4 years during World War I. So there's this sort of notion that he is at the height of his power. The speeches that he gives right now are basically speeches where he says the German soldier cannot be stopped, that nothing can stop the German juggernaut. And that's, of course, when, in the mind of the Nazis as well as the German High Command, emerges the idea, instead of getting imports from Russia and paying for them, mostly what you have still up to 1941 is that the Soviet Union supplies raw material while Germany provides a lot of technological know-how in return and finished products. So, but the Nazi leadership believes that we can just launch into the Soviet Union and take the stuff ourselves. So we don't have to pay for it, and there's nothing can be done. The idea of invading the Soviet Union, which is of course a giant compared to everything else. I mean, just let me go back, just to give you some impression. I mean, Germany may have control over this. If you're looking at the Soviet Union right here, you're looking at about 20% of the entire country. It continues, and continues. Okay, this is a big country. This is a very big country. But the idea of invading the Soviet Union is really something that predates the Nazi takeover in January of 1933. It really emerges from an idea that I've already mentioned, this notion of Lebensraum, which translates in English as living space. Living space. The notion is one that was not just developed by the Germans, but also by the French and by the English. And the notion is that your country is too crowded. And because it's so crowded, it needs room for expansion. The British and the French had seen this in terms of imperial expansion. In other words, go out into Asia, go out into Africa, and grab as much territory as you can. But what we will see under the Nazis, this idea of living space will not go overseas, but will try to stay within Germany and its neighboring countries. Now, why would you argue for this? Well, living space is basically very much connected to imperial expansion. Why do you need to take on colonies? I mean, officially you claim that you're going overseas to Africa and Asia because you want to civilize these people, right? They need you. You want to upbring them. But really underneath, the ugly side of imperialism is that you're looking for resources to keep your economy going. Again, this whole notion that the Nazis had of autarky, of creating self-sufficiency, is tied to this idea of creating, not only finding resources that you can extract, but you can also find markets in these colonies. In other words, you force these people who are under your imperial control to purchase your products. Best example, where this is still happening today, you can go to LAX, you can take Air Tahiti Nui, you can fly to Papeete, Tahiti, and order beer, or order anything, French wine. You'll be surprised how expensive that place is. And that's because Tahiti is still a dependency of France. Therefore, the French forced the Tahitian pretty much to take over their own items. So it's a very expensive place. And the reason for this is because the Tahitians, for instance, cannot import stuff from New Zealand and Australia. That will be much closer. So it's still with us today. This is not something, and I mean, after all, it's debated also, among some of the political candidates whether this should be done in the United States as well. And there's always that thing: is do you have collateral treaties? Do you want to be renegotiated? All of this, of course, is something that is an age-old idea. Do you erect boundaries on trade? This is also very much behind the Brexit. So the ideas that you find in living space, ideas that are being discussed right now. So the other thing is, and this is something that emerged in the 19th century, there was the fear that countries such as France, England, Germany were losing all their young men and women to newer countries such as the United States of America. When you're looking at the United States of America, especially following the American Civil War, you have these waves of immigration coming from Europe, and there was a concern in the countries that you were losing your best and brightest. In other words, you would lose those individuals who were highly educated, who knew all their trades. So there was the notion that something needed to be done about this, that you're losing it to the United States, but the United States is not the only country that would attract young people. Of course, they also go to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, just to mention a few, Argentina, Canada. would also be different countries that would attract individuals. So what could you do about it? Well, the argument was, if you acquire colonies overseas, since these young people clearly had a lot of energies and they wanted to have some adventure, then you would say, well, instead of going to the United States, why don't you go to Tunisia? Or why don't you go to Uganda? Or why don't you go to German Southwest Africa? Just to mention a few examples here. So in other words, redirect your young people into your own colonies. And then you don't lose them. Then they still maintain this sort of link of being German and not German Americans, right? Because there's sort of notion that you lose them. And this is something that went also in the mind of Hitler. I'm gonna return to this very quickly. So living space is something that was also bounced around during the Weimar Republic. After Mein Kampf, when Hitler took power, the second most sold book in Germany was this one, Volk ohne Raum, which means people without space. People without space. And the author basically, it's a novel, it's a fictionalized account about a family that was expelled from German Southwest Africa after the colony was lost at the end of World War I. And then they were cramped in Germany and all of these bad things happened to the family. The big moral here is that Germany is too cramped, too industrialized, and Germany really needs room to expand. It needs living space. So the Nazis would take a little spin on this. I mean, one of the interesting things, this is a very rare poster here, there was within the Nazi movement a very small movement that wanted to reclaim the German colonies that were lost after World War I. This is a good example of this, you know, how within the Nazi movement there were some that thought the Nazis would return the colonies. That's why I'm saying the colonial idea survives, but barely. Because Hitler has a very, very different view of living space. He doesn't believe that we should go overseas. Right? It's not in colonial acquisition that we must see the solution of this problem, but exclusively in the acquisition of a territory for settlement. And this is very important, because Hitler actually learned from history. He realized that the German colonies didn't attract a whole lot of settlers. I mean, when you're looking at places like German Southwest Africa, maybe a few thousand people went there. If you're looking at places like New Guinea, you had a few dozen people that went there. So the German colonies really didn't attract a lot of settlers, which will enhance the area of the mother country, and hence not only keep the new settlers in the most intimate community with the land of their origin, but secure for total area those advantages which lie in its unified magnitude. Blah, 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 blah. Basically, he's saying, and he doesn't really mention it outright, but he was very much informed by the example of the United States of America. The 13 original colonies, mostly settled by English or British settlers. What happens? Well, there's an ocean in between. You guys become restless. Ultimately, you have a declaration of independence and you cut the ties during the American Revolutionary War. This is something that Hitler wants to avoid. So in other words, let's not go overseas because we don't want to repeat the example of the United States of America. We really want to have a territory that is adjacent to Germany. And that's why living space for Hitler really was an expansion towards the east. Why an expansion towards the east? Well, the east, of course, is full with resources. And I mentioned this already before, oil being one of them, but also foodstuff, in particular grains. But you also have a lot of minerals, iron ore, tungsten, all kinds of different things that you can find, coal, that you can find, of course, in the expansion here. And here is the key. There's a lot of millions and millions of people living here. But according to Nazi ideology, and Dr. Volkan will tell you more about this, the people that live here are subhuman. They're not your own. They're inferior to your own. And so what can you do? In order to have the cramped German condition, you basically denude this place of all the Slavs that are living here, and you will take people who are Aryan to resettle the living space. Now, we'll get to that, what that means to denude this. I mean, officially you would evacuate these people, But as we will see, that's a euphemism very much for elimination, extermination. So this is what it would look like. The Germans didn't want to have all of the Soviet Union, partially because they realized, come back to your question, that if you go too far, you might get into conflict with the Japanese. So you really just want the areas that are very rich in resources, and then you will have that area that will decide what to do with it later. Right? This is basically, most of the resources and most of the industrial centers are of course located here. You have Moscow, you have Leningrad, you have Kiev. So you have most of the industrial centers here. While this is just a vast expanse of land, climate is not so great, so you can't really use it for agriculture much. So that was something that the Nazis weren't so much after. So this is what they envisioned. Did it get to that? To cut a long story short, no. And that's a good thing. I put this in my lecture. I know it's not in your PowerPoint slides, but this is something I already talked about last time on Tuesday, how important the Soviet Union was in supplying the German economy. I mentioned this earlier, that after 1940, the Soviets supplied somewhere between 70 to 85% of the German imports. So you could truly say biting the hand that feeds you. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a gamble, a dangerous gamble. If it's successful, great. You can get to occupy all the resources, then you don't have to pay anything in return. But what if this is not successful? Then what do you do? Because then you basically cut off all these imports here, and you go back to the earlier time when the Soviet Union was not supplying your war. The Nazis also tried to sell the invasion of the Soviet Union as not a German idea, but really an idea that would unify all of Europe. Again, this sort of notion that the Nazis would bring Europe together in a common agenda. And these are posters that of course came out depicting, again, the Soviets not just as subhumans. You see, they almost have this sort of rat-like face. They're like vermin. Again, this sort of notion that individuals are sort of like a disease. They're not, what the Nazis, not just the Nazis, but fascists often do, is they see the country as a living organism, and you have to protect the living organism by doing your own self-sacrifice. And a living organism, of course, is threatened from the outside by individuals who don't belong to you, who are racially inferior. Not only that, and that's of course how they're selling it to Europe, that this individual, of course, is going to kick what unites Europe. And according to the Nazis, that is Christianity. We already talked about how Hitler's view of Christianity was somewhat ambiguous. He really didn't like it, partially because it was initially a Semitic religion. Jesus is a Jew. But you realize that in this case, what is the common denominator of all Europeans? They're to some extent Christians. So you basically use Christianity here as something that needs to be protected from the horde. Again, often what you see is that these individuals are depicted as individuals coming from Asia, having Asiatic traits, but also having traits, of course, of the one population that the Nazis feared the most and hated the most, Jewish traits. And that's why they often link Bolshevikism with Judaism. And there's a lot of contradiction here. Sometimes the Jews are great capitalists, sometimes they're great communists. Again, to some extent that makes sense in some sort of parallel universe, but they didn't spend too much time on this. That's why they like to bring up caricatures. And you see here that here are all the allies coming together, different flags. Of course, the German flag. Here you have the Finnish flag. Here you have the Romanian flag. I don't even know what kind of flag that is. But you have the Finnish flag over here, the French flag over here, the Norwegian flag over here. And this is a map that also shows that this campaign against the Soviets is really an international campaign. Because it shows that individuals are joining the fight in the East from all kinds of countries. Mussolini, of course, sent soldiers I mentioned already before that the Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who's the dictator of Spain, is sending a small contingent known as the Blue Division to fight there. So supposedly this is an international European fight. But the idea behind it, of course, is very much German. Living space, Lebens. But you can't really sell that to the French, you can't sell that to the Spanish, you can't sell that to the Finns. So you have to talk about, we have to defend our homeland from communism, Judaism. I almost like to, turn this over to Dr. Vulcan, because there's some historians that have speculated as to why this campaign was named Barbarossa. The campaign against many of the targets in the West had great names. To give you about one example, the campaign against Great Britain was known as Sea Lion. The campaign against the Dutch, the Belgians, and the French just had a code name, which was Yellow. But why pick Barbarossa? And that's always something that leads to this whole notion, did Hitler have a death wish? And that brings us back to Dr. Vulcan's lecture. Because Barbarossa, again, is a very controversial figure, to say the least, in German history. He was a German emperor who joined the Third Crusade. He never made it to the Holy Land because he was riding his horse in full armor. He was riding through a river, fell off the horse, and because he was in full armor, he sank to the bottom of that river and drowned. Not a great end, not a good way to die. He didn't even fight against the infidels. There's nothing there. So his body's pulled out of the river, he's giving a burial, and ultimately the whole Third Crusade just collapses on itself. But the notion is that Barbarossa was entombed in a mountain, and from this mountain the notion was, there's a sort of heroic thing, that he wasn't really dead, that when Germany was in trouble, Barbarossa would wake up and would guide Germany to a victorious end. So on one hand you can see how this myth of Barbarossa probably informed Hitler. On the other hand, there are some historians speculating that perhaps Hitler had a death wish. I'm not sure what to make of this, but yes, question. No. Okay. Let me go on. I mean, what I like is that most historians now pretty much will say that Hitler grossly underestimated the mind of the Soviet Union, both in terms of the output, the industrial output, and just to give you a little bit of background, Dr. Cordero talked about the 5-year plans, several 5-year plans that really heavily industrialized the Soviet Union. They came at a tremendous human cost. I mean, we should not forget this. Collectivization of farmland, for instance, cost millions and millions of deaths, people. But what is remarkable about the 5-year plans, that as we move into the late 1930s, the Soviet Union has become an industrialized country. And between the 1920s and 1930s, just to give you some random figures here, Stalin is able to increase the electrical output of the Soviet Union by about 1,000%. Okay, so yes, you have that it comes at this tremendous cost in blood. But on the other hand, if you just look at what the Soviet Union accomplishes throughout the 1930s, it becomes truly an industrial nation. And that's something that the Germans do not necessarily see. And that's partially because Stalin is very good in masking what's going on. Stalin is also very paranoid, extremely paranoid, as a matter of fact. So what Stalin has already foreseen is that somebody will invade him eventually. So what Stalin does is move the centers of production away from the Soviet borders, deep and deep into the Soviet Union. And this will become a major positive thing too, because Dr. Norris will talk about this. The Germans have not developed the capability of systematically bombing the industrial complex. Partially because when you're looking at German bombers, they're mostly two-engine bombers. They're not the same as the Flying Fortresses or the Lancasters that you see over German skies. So Dr. Norris will talk about this. The Germans focus more on tactical things. They want to attack troops that are immediately behind the front line. So in other words, tactical is more important than strategic. Strategic is when you're trying to take out the potential of a country to fight. So Hitler is grossly underestimating the Soviet Union.
What did Hitler's generals say about this?
They're with him in this one, most of them. I should say there's some that are a little worried, but partially because of the success that Hitler claims that was his success, but the success of his generals in 1940 and 1941 have also created this sort of groupthink, for the lack of a better term, that really the thought in the mind of the German generals is that nothing can stop the German soldier. That the Germans have the best technology, the Germans have the best tanks, and we'll talk about this. We'll talk about the technology they have. And that some people said, well, there were some naysayers, but the yaysayers outnumbered the naysayers. And the naysayers will actually ultimately be phased out. The last event would be something that happened yesterday. Actually, yesterday was the 76th anniversary, I believe, 76th anniversary of the attempt to overthrow Hitler. July 20th, 1944. So the other thing is, again, comparing, contrasting Stalin. This is not going to be on your exam, but it's a very interesting thing to see. Initially, Stalin, in the 1930s, and this is something that inspired the German military too, in the 1930s, Stalin has purged. Much of what's happening in Turkey right now, scary thing. Stalin has purged his own army. So many of the very capable generals, many of the very capable field marshals are gone, or in prison, or executed. They're gone. So the Germans are saying this is an opportunity, and what you will see is that initially the Germans are very successful. However, and this is something that contrasts nicely with Hitler, while Hitler now believes that he is a genius, a military genius, which he wasn't at all, and Dr. Norris will tell you about this, especially he will hold back important weapons, for instance the jet fighter, the assault rifle. By the way, assault rifle, Sturmgewehr, is a term that Hitler introduced. Okay? Just when we talk about gun debates and stuff, that comes directly from Adolf. So this is something that is interesting because Hitler sees himself as this genius, so he will try to take more control over his generals. So what you will see is that as the war gets badly, Hitler will actually fire and hire a lot of generals. While Stalin, on the other hand, after his purges, will withdraw and will give his marshals and generals a certain degree of leeway so they can operate on their own. They often are encouraged to compete against each other. And that's why you get such brilliant minds as Zhukov, for instance, who will become probably he's up there with Patton. He's not well known because not many people talk about the Eastern Front, but so we see that difference as well happening. All right, Operation Barbarossa. A couple of statistics and why this operation is different from stuff that happened in the West. It was the largest up to that point, I should say, because when we talk about largest, especially in World War I, you always have one campaign and then a few years later the next campaign will completely outnumber that. But up to 1941, this was the largest army the world had seen. The Germans had amassed about 3.3 million soldiers. Again, the international component is important here. The majority of these were German, about 75%, but about a fourth of this particular German army is not. So there are units, there are Finnish units, there are Romanian units, there are Bulgarian units, there are volunteer units, and we'll talk more about these that come from France, from Italy, from Spain. There is a little bit of an international component. The main objective is to reach the line of two cities, Assastran and Ark-Andrelansk. Let me go back to the map here. So these are not just bizarre terms, but Ark-Andrelansk is located roughly over here. Assastran is located very closely to the Caspian Sea. It's called also the AA line. Okay, that's not Alcoholic Anonymous, but that comes from these two cities. What is the major crucial difference between Operation Barbarossa and everything and all the war that happened before? The main crucial difference, and I already mentioned this, is ideology. Ideology. And how can you see that ideology intervenes in this war right away, in Operation Barbarossa right away? Because we have already orders, two individual troops that make these difference. The first one is something that Dr. Volkan will talk to you more about when he talks about the Holocaust by bullets. This is the forerunner of the extermination camp. There are special troops formed, mostly component of the SS, but also some units of the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht is just the German army. These guys are known as the Einsatzgruppen. Just means special forces for special tasks. And what are these special tasks? These are not just special tasks that they're trying to secure, let's see, easy access for the German armed forces, but these are special forces who work in the back of the advancing German army, rounding up Jewish elements and just shooting them. Not just Jewish elements, but everybody who was deemed racially inferior. This could be Sinti and Roma. These could be communist commissars, in other words, political soldiers. These could be individuals deemed partisans. Partisans are basically civilians who take up arms. And how do you distinguish between a partisan and one that is not? It's a very, very thin line. So these special forces are already there. This is something that's unique. This did not happen in France. This did not happen in Poland. You did not have Einsatzgruppen. These are new things. And what are these Einsatzgruppen responsible for? Eliminating individuals who are deemed racially inferior and by extension dangerous. Second major, military jurisdiction curtailed. To give you a couple of examples, German soldiers were shot in France for committing crimes against the civilian population, raped, for instance, or they were severely punished for doing that. That was not the case on the Eastern Front. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers were given basically a blank check. They could do whatever they wanted. So it says here, guerrilla and their assistants killed immediately. What are guerrilla fighters? These are civilians supposedly that take up arms. But what if you go into, let's say, the house of somebody in the Ukraine and you find a shotgun in the corner, a shotgun that this particular peasant is using to supplement his diet by hunting the occasional rabbit. Then the German soldier can say, you have a shotgun, you're obviously a guerrilla fighter, we're going to shoot you. Or worse, we're going to set your house on fire, we're going to shoot you, we're going to shoot your entire family. We're going to wipe you off the face of the earth. Any consequences of this action? No. Nobody will be court-martialed, nobody would be trialed for this. It already shows different kind of war. The very important Commissar order. Troops were given the Commissar order. Any political commissar, these are political soldiers that are part of the Soviet army. If you would be identified as a commissar, you would be taken out, interrogated first, and then shot. Again, ideology. You're a communist. You're dead. You're gone. Or sometimes shot first and then interrogated later. Just the end result is the same. You're dead. You're done. Something that really bothered me, I mean, all of this is terrible. No doubt. but it's this, guideline for troop conduct. Okay, if you are a German soldier and you enter Soviet soil, when you were given troop conduct, very strict troop conduct lines when you entered France. Is it you always tell me about that video? Oh no, I think it's my English friend always tells me that he saw a particular German video from about 1940 where the German troops are marching into France and then all of a sudden they're doing this zigzagging. And people are wondering why. Because there are signs in French that says, do not step on the grass, please. The Germans just, zigzag around it. Because they're very strict troop conduct. You're basically told, adhere to the laws of the country, do not upset the civilians, do not plunder, do not rape, do not kill, do have respect for them because we're trying to win that civilian population over. You going into the East, those kind of guidelines of troop conduct are out of the window. Ruthless measures against Bolshevik agitators, guerrilla units, saboteurs, and Jews. All very, very flexible categories. How do you determine that somebody's a Jew? I mean, obviously, Dr. Cordero gave the importance of the sort of statistical things that the Germans did in Germany. But you're moving into the Soviet Union, you don't have those statistics. You can't move into a particular village and say, okay, here we know we have 30 Jewish individuals. So you have to rely on other things, on just superficial markers. Well, you look Jewish, so we're going to take you and kill you. Or you're relying on individuals in the village themselves who don't like somebody and they want to get even and saying, yeah, he's a Jew or he's a communist. So you're taken out, shot. This whole thing happens also to saboteurs. How is somebody a saboteur? Because they have a shotgun in the unit? Are they a saboteur? Are they a guerrilla fighter? Are they a Bolshevik agitator? So all of these are very fluid categories. But in other words, what you're telling your soldiers is, whatever you do, it's okay. There will be no consequences of your actions. You will not be brought to trial. Be as ruthless as you want. There will be no consequences. And that's a scary thing. All right, so let me play a little bit of a video for you. I talked about the importance of propaganda, so let me show you some of these propaganda movies that you would see in Nazi Germany. I tried to select all of those that have subtitles. This one doesn't. Unfortunately, there was one that did, but they pulled it off YouTube. Dr. Volkan can talk about that too, that they constantly change things. So this one doesn't have subtitles. But imagine yourself sitting in a cinema, you're watching a movie, and before you watch a movie, they actually give you the newsreel. And the newsreel, there's a new newsreel that comes out every 2 weeks. And there's a new music that the Nazis would introduce to make announcement from the Eastern Front. And I'm going to talk about this. It shows you also the importance of propaganda and how powerful some of the Nazi propaganda is. So let me get this started.
20. Juni.
Oops. Let me start this from the beginning.
Vor der Reichskanzlei in den frühen Morgenstunden des
Basically, they're announcing that at 5:30 a.m. that the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union.
Das Haus des Rundfunks.
This is the major radio station in Germany.
Über alle deutschen Sender wird vorbereitet.
To show you the sort of power that you have here, propaganda, the machines that you see there. The music you hear in the background is new music component. Look at that's a radio tower in Berlin. The music that you hear in the background is the musically that is just composed for the Eastern Front. Every time you would hear this over the radio, that means you will get news from the Eastern Front. Goebbels, you see how Goebbels is now basically declaring why the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union. He's saying if we wouldn't have done it, they would have invaded us. He basically said there was some sort of alliance between Moscow and London, so we had to strike first. This is the foreign minister, Ribbentrop, who's basically speaking in front of the foreign press, announcing the same thing. Germany had to strike first. So basically you see radio. Again, showing that it's an international campaign, reaching from Romania to Finland. So they're basically talking about all these nations that are part of this: Italy, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Finland. The best soldiers of the world are there to protect culture against the barbarism of the East. And now, of course, you get a lot of image of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Of course, the notion that you get here is that nothing can stop the German soldier, that they're invincible, and you see all these different images of Germans marching forward. This is in East Prussia. So they're basically taking down border markers. Notice that the music almost sounds like Oktoberfest. You know, there's this sort of happy thing that this is going to be a walk in the park. Nothing to fear. So they're basically taking down the border markations. Goes on and on and on. There you have the resistance by snipers happening. I can give you the link if you're interested, but it really is just more and more images about different theaters of the Eastern Front, where you see the Germans advance and nothing can stop them. But it gets more sinister. I will tell you this in a little bit. Didn't want to go backwards. I have to give links to that stuff. Let me continue a while longer, and then we will take a break. The German offensive of 1941 and 1942 is an offensive that initially is very successful. It seems to be another one of you have heard the term before, another one of the very successful German blitzkrieg, lightning wars. Nothing can stop the Germans. This shows the furthest advance into the Soviet Union. The Germans, during the fall of 1941, managed to encircle Leningrad. They are on the outskirts of Moscow, and they've taken Kiev and Minsk. Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Of course, to cut a long story short, ultimately the advance will stop at a very famous city, right over here. That is the city of Stalingrad. There's also an attempt to take the Caucasus. These are extremely rich in oil. So these are important resources that the Germans are after. Sorry. Treatment of prisoners, because here's another thing.
Did they invade in the wintertime?
No, summer. June 22nd, 1941. As a matter of fact, they tried to invade earlier, but the campaign in Yugoslavia pushed the timeline by about 3 to 4 years. The initial invasion was planned for late May, but because the Yugoslav and the Greek campaign took place in April, it was pushed further down. But the notion was that it will be over in a few months. But a good question because we get to that. Will you invade in the wintertime? Not a good idea. The Russian winter is bad.
So is the goal to take over the whole USSR, or just these like important resource areas?
Well, as I showed you earlier, the goal was to ultimately take over this area.
Is that the resource area?
That is where most of the resources are. When you move further here, then you don't have that many people. You don't have many resources, and most of what you have here is not agricultural land, because it becomes very important to also. Most of what you have here and here, and I'll show you this on a different map, these are extremely fertile agricultural lands, especially in the Ukraine. And that's why you have a major battle over the Ukraine happening right now. The Crimean Peninsula, for instance, you probably heard about that one, since Putin has just taken that one over. It's very strategic, but it's also part, especially the upper part of the Crimea, is extremely fertile. It's also where you get the Crimean sparkling wine, the famous one, because that's one of the few areas in the Soviet Union where you can grow grapes. All right, let me talk about another difference happening in this campaign in the East, and that's the treatment of prisoner. I mean, the Germans, of course, already between 1939 and 1941 have taken hundreds and thousands of prisoners. French, Dutch, Belgians, Polish individuals. But generally, they treated these prisoners with respect. They adhered to the Geneva Convention, not so much when they turned east. I have a few images here. This is from 1940. You see Germans taking Frenchmen into the rear. You see the Germans are smiling. The Frenchmen not so much. I mean, they suffered defeat, but their treatment was generally benign. Dr. Volkan mentioned, for instance, Sartre as one example. That the Frenchmen were in prisoner of war camps, but some of them were let go. They joined the Vichy French government. So the treatment not so bad. You fast forward to 1941. This, of course, is always the very shocking image. This is Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. He's looking at this Soviet soldier with contempt. And this is what happened in many ways. The Soviets that were captured, and there were many. It is estimated that, especially between 1941 and 1942, the Germans captured close to 6 million Soviet soldiers. Other armies would have been dead, decapitated. But this is the other statistics. Of these, 3.3 million people would be killed. And when I say killed, they weren't necessarily shot. Some were. Some were hung, some were shot. But most of these figures come from systematic starvation, refusing to feed them. So you basically kill these individuals. And this is an image of how prisoners had to rely on their own to march into the rear. The Germans would not give them transportation, they would not give them vans, they would not give them railways. In many ways, they were forced to march on foot. If you have to think of a parallel, it will be the Bataan Death March, in American history. Yes.
And why not fight? I mean, they knew they were going to die anyway. I mean, there's 5.8 million of them. I mean,
I'm not sure that they knew that they were going to die. And that's the thing, because the Germans initially, and this comes back to a question that Dr. Volkan asked earlier, the Germans used very effective propaganda against Soviet soldiers. They basically said, surrender, nothing will happen to you, we'll take care of you. So the promise was that these Soviet soldiers would be treated well. Did they fulfill that promise? The answer is
yeah,
no.
but I mean, after a few months, they must have caught on that.
Later on in the war, yes.
Yes, but then you are severely undernourished. You see that you're behind barbed wire. You don't have your weapons. I mean, you had uprisings. You certainly did. I mean, this was something that did happen. But generally, they will be very short-lived.
And in the beginning, too, they weren't treated really well, by Stalin either. And so, maybe they thought, oh, well, prisoner of war, might as well surrender. But later on, a couple things happened. First of all, if you surrender, if the guys behind you and the Soviet troops don't think you're doing a good enough job, they'll shoot you.
Yes.
So being the Soviet army, not fun. And then, our Reiner's going to talk later, what happens to these guys after the war is also not very good.
They were really, because when the Soviet army goes into Germany and liberates many of them, they actually start shooting them because they see them as cowards. You have surrendered.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why we fought so long is because of your fault.
Yeah. And if they don't get shot, it's almost certain they're going off to a
gulag.
camp, a gulag.
How much of this like change in tactics on the Eastern Front was like based on like just the visibility of the Soviet Union to like maybe the rest of the Allied forces, even those that like the U.S. that hadn't been in yet? Because you said they were like later on they were industrialized. So you go to France, and maybe there's more Allied forces, and they seem like, oh well, they've been industrialized longer. Maybe not necessarily allies with them yet, but it's like, okay, we go over there and we see, and this is bad. I mean, they're occupying all these countries, but it's not, you know, the true horrors of war you're seeing on this side. Did something go on with the Nazis and their tactics saying, hey, nobody knows about the Soviets, nobody cares about the Soviets, they're just recently industrialized, who are they giving anything to except for us?
Sure. I think that is part of the reason. Although the relationship between the Soviet Union and Germany was always fairly cordial. To give you one example, and Dr. Norris will talk about this, when the Germans, after the Treaty of Versailles, were not allowed to build tanks and aircrafts, but the Soviet Union actually invited them in, and there were major connections between the fighting forces. So I think on the level of technology, not so much. I think it's ideology. There's a notion that these guys are...
And don't be mistaken, those kind of things, there was, both sides wanted something. So when they did the tank training in the Soviet Union, the Soviets got technology, they got strategy, and the Germans got a place to actually practice and develop their tank stuff. So there was a mutual thing they said. But those officers who were involved in that, who later were then promoted, are mostly among the officers that Stalin purges, because he thinks they've had cordial interactions with the Germans, and so they're not to be trusted. So they get promoted into generals, high positions, and they're the ones that he gets rid of.
Right.
Which is a lot of expertise that he's gotten rid of from his army.
Which I could see, and especially with the paranoia of Stalin, but it just seems to me like with the Treaty of Versailles and the war guilt and everything that went on there, like the way that France really stepped down on Germany after World War I, wanted to be a little bit more, like angry towards the French. And
yes, no, that's a very good point. But the Germans, I mean, I'm not saying that they behaved like gentlemen when they invaded France, but when you compare it to the Eastern Front, you see a lot more restraint.
Right. I just meant like, was there a lot more light going on in Western Europe than there was in Eastern Europe internationally, which caused them to act a certain...
Well, there's something to be said for that. I mean, one of the things in America, and Dr. Buschmann has hit on this a little bit already, but I'll reiterate it. One thing is, as Americans, we consider the war to basically have started in 1941, and we tend to think of it centering around our involvement in the war. The Italy campaign, North Africa campaign, D-Day, those are big events for us. We consider that to be the majority of the war. When reality, those things, as big, as important as they were actually just sideshows compared to the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front, you had lots more, people involved, millions and millions of troops on either side, huge front lines, and the other theaters were almost, if you were Stalin, you wanted D-Day because it was a distraction. You wanted a distraction. And so, we tend to overemphasize and see our part of the war as, as bigger than it really was. And if you read the Timothy Snyder book, Bloodlands, he really talks about this. We don't, as Americans, have any real good conception of how large the war was in the East. And, it's far away. We weren't fighting in the Eastern War.
The United States, I should say, though, after December 7th, especially after December 11th, when Germany declared war on the United States, you would supply.
Yeah.
You would bring a lot of, partially I mean, this has also been exaggerated, but one of the reasons why the Soviet Union, especially during 1942, is able to withstand the second German attack has a lot to do with material coming in from the USA and from Great Britain. That's why you have the major supply line going through the Baltic Ocean.
Yeah. So we send a lot of stuff to them,
Yeah.
but we don't, it's not like we send an expeditionary force to fight along the Soviets in the Eastern Front. We don't really have that.
So at the beginning of when the Eastern Front began, how aware were like the everyday Soviet soldiers of the treatment of POWs on the Western Front? Did they know that there was a huge difference in how they were being treated versus like French soldiers?
As a matter of fact, if you're looking at your regular soldier, generally, and again I'm exaggerating here, but the person's probably literate. Literacy is just beginning. Literacy rates in the Soviet Union, well, industrialization, Soviet Union is pulling up, but when it comes to educational level, not the same. So, and how would you get the information? It's not something that you do have a newspaper in the Soviet Union. My favorite title, it's called the Pravda. Translates as truth. So, you know, much of what you get fed is, if you can read, is Soviet propaganda. And Soviet propaganda has been fairly benign on the Germans, because after the treaty that was signed in August of 1939, the Germans, of course, emerged not as this capitalistic thing, but in many ways a brother understands. And so there's also an attempt, really weird attempt by the Soviets to portray the National Socialist as socialist first, nationalist second. So they're really, you know, to beef up that socialism. So what little information you could gather is you ultimately believe the Germans are good guys. Of course, all of this changes as soon as Germany invades, then that propaganda goes around, but many of these soldiers that were captured in the first months of the war were to some extent surprised by this. And then, you know, coming back to your question about why didn't they rebel, because many of these individuals didn't necessarily feel as Soviets. You know, as Soviet citizens, they felt as Ukrainians, they felt as Belarus. They believed that the Germans would ultimately restore their nationality to the Ukraine. The Germans had no such purpose, but there was the notion that you're liberating us from Stalin. So, and that's probably what happened here. And in some ways, these individuals, there was a certain relief. You're out of the carnage. You see, you know, because most of these prisoners are taking in gigantic. How do you call it? In Germany, we call it Calderon, because you surround the troops. Kesselschlacht. What's the equivalent? How do you call that that you surround the troops and you have hundreds and thousands. Basically, it's a pocket. Okay. A pocket of individuals who just see the Germans being everywhere, because you're trying to break out, they shoot at you, bombs come falling down, you just shell-shocked beyond belief. You surrender, and you're hoping for the best. You know.
Surround. You surround. No.
Siege, flanking.
It starts with a pincher movement.
Yeah.
Flanking.
What do you call the
But then at
people
the
that are
end
inside this?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah. But there's a military term for that.
Siege.
No, it's not a siege. If you want an example of it, watch that
Because we
second to last Game of
call it
Thrones
a
episode.
calderon. It's where you heat water in.
Yeah, and you pressure everybody.
Yeah, you pressure
Yeah.
everybody. That's what it's called in Germany.
Yeah, so watch that Game of Thrones episode where they had the battle, because it's a really good example of that. Medieval example of that.
Yeah, actually, the Germans were inspired by Hannibal, the Battle of Cannae.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, and that was such a movement, pincer movement he created, and ultimately he just
Reiner, are you going to mention too about there was a Soviet army that was captured that actually was given the chance to switch sides
Yes.
and
I
fight
know.
against the Soviets?
Yeah, but keep in mind, we're not giving the chances.
Yeah.
It's late in the war.
Late in the
because
war.
There is I think his name is Vasilov,
Yeah, that's the one.
and he actually creates a free Russian army working for the Nazis, but that is in 1944. where a lot of the people that are fighting in this army first to complain because they're not getting the best weapons from the Germans. They're basically getting the technology of 1941, and there's a big jump between 1941 and 1944. So you're getting what the Germans had conquered, had used, and they're basically decimated. And once these soldiers are captured by the Russians, they were killed. Vasilov was executed at the end.
The Germans send in kind of like one guy in to say, hey, we're going to give you a chance to surrender.
Yes.
If you don't surrender,
Yes.
you're gone.
Yes, as a matter of fact, the Germans use very effectively what Dr. Volkan already showed you, leaflets. You know, that you drop over the Soviet soldiers. And they also use gigantic microphones that you basically boom onto the other side, where you have individuals in Russian speaking to them and saying, lay down your weapons, your treatment will be well, we will respect you. And the leaflet that you got from the plane, if you would, that would be your safe conduct. If you show this to the German soldier, because the German soldiers don't all speak Russian, but it would be bilingual, the leaflet that you would have, it would be in Russian and German. So in German it would say, German soldier, if you see this soldier coming to you, presenting you with this leaflet, they want to surrender. So it was a good faith, on one hand, from the prisoners, from these future POWs. There was a notion that the Germans would treat them well. And that's partially also because POWs, you knew that it wouldn't be a great existence. You probably knew that you would have to suffer, but in some ways, you don't have to fight no more, the war is over. And that's basically what the Germans would tell the Soviets. They would tell you, your war is over. You can go home now.
There was some solace knowing that you're gonna
Yes.
have to fight.
Yes, that you're safe. Your mother will see you again. Your father will see you again. You will see your wife. You will see your children. That whole leaflet that Dr. Volkan showed you about, you know, the sort of scare tactics that how many women will be waiting and baying. Yes. But here's another propaganda poster that very shockingly shows again, I mean, on one hand, it illustrates, this was issued in late 1941, it illustrates, of course, how many prisoners were captured in the East. And the first impression of this is to show you that, well, the Soviet army has lost 3 million Soviet soldiers, 3 million POWs, so we basically have decapitated the Soviet army. That's, of course, the most obvious, and then they show you how many people were captured in Poland, France, the Balkan campaign, and comparing this to World War I. You know, again, with the Russians, there were 1.5 million Russians, English, and France. Now, but there's also something else going on. Look at the depiction of the Russian from World War I. He's a sort of, looks almost like a drunk uncle. He's got vodka under his arm, he has a beard. He's a sort of like pleasant-looking individual. A bumbling, pleasant-looking individual, but not somebody who's necessarily dangerous. Fast forward to 1941. You see again this sort of fierce-looking individual who seemingly is not human. And this is something that you definitely see the transformation from the 1914, 1918 Russian to somebody who, of course, this is before the Russian Revolution has happened, that has transformed him racially as well as ideologically into something that is not your equal. And this is something that you see also again in the newsreels, and that's one thing I want to play to you. So let me show you a newsreel, and then we're going to take a little break.
Bolschewistische Flieger. Alarm! Sie greifen einen Flugplatz an. Der Flugplatz blieb völlig unbeschädigt. Es gab nur einige belanglose Sprengtrichter am Rande. Ein abgeschossenes Sowjetflugzeug. Deutsche Jäger nehmen sofort die Verfolgung der übrigen auf. Einer der Bomber ist gestellt, er versucht zu entkommen. In dieser Zeitlupenaufnahme wird die Treffsicherheit unserer Jäger besonders deutlich. Erledigt. Ein zweiter Bomber wird aufs Korn genommen. Auch er wird außer Gefecht gesetzt. Die Sowjets haben auf dem Rückzug große Strecken von Wäldern in Ausführung der von Stalin selbst gegebenen Weisung in Brand gesteckt. Sie hofften, den deutsch-finnischen Vormarsch damit aufhalten zu können. Schon aber steht eine Vorausabteilung dicht vor Salah und kämpft sich immer näher an diesen Ort heran, der von den Bolschewisten zäh verteidigt wird. Am 8. Juli nahmen die deutschen Verbände durch Umfassungsbewegungen finnischer Kräfte unterstützt diesen befestigten Platz. Lagebesprechung auf einem Feldflughafen im hohen Norden. Ein finnischer Offizier. Stukas fertig zum Feindflug. Sie sollen die bolschewistischen Stellungen um Salah sturmreif werfen. Vor dem Start muss der Platz von Renntieren freigemacht werden. Hier liegt bis in den Sommer hinein Schnee. Bomben auf feindliche Feldstellungen.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there. If you're interested in these links, I can present them to you. Before I get to your question, compare this, the individuals that you've shown here and their faces. I mean, what are some of the main patterns that you see? I mean, of the prisoners.
A lot of Asians.
Very good. You know, so the notion that these are not Europeans, that these are not like us, excellent. Yes. What else?
Well, I was going to say that was the Red Army malnourished just to begin with, because every single one of those soldiers
Yes.
were malnourished. It looked like they had maybe like 3 weeks before they dropped.
Absolutely. Bad equipment, bad, you know, the uniforms are shabby, the shoes are shabby. That's another aspect, that you're fighting really a ragtag army that cannot give you much resistance. I don't know if you noticed it, but remember when I showed you that documentary about eugenics and euthanasia, victims of the past, the images that came across there, and comparing that to some of the images that you see here, that supposedly these individuals look much like the individuals suffering from hereditary diseases in Germany, that these again are not fully human beings. And this is interesting, this comes across in documentaries. I mean, these are documentaries that German people are shown, this sort of notion, and you get this, the notion that A, this is it's a ragtag army, and B, that these guys are hordes from the east, are somehow much below. And of course, who do they select? Probably the percentage of Asians fighting initially in the Red Army, it would rise up later in the war, is probably less than 10% at this point. So you're selectively pulling out individuals who fit the stereotype of what you're trying to put out there. So it's very selectively. The people that you put on in front of the camera, this is something that you selectively do. Okay. So why don't we take a break? 5, 10 minutes. Another aspect of this, and this harks back to some of the questions that you had, was the German treatment of different ethnic populations, especially in the so-called bloodlands, places of the Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic Republic. There were a number of people who did not like Stalin, who did not like the Soviet Union, and they were hoping that the Germans would somehow return the nation to them. In other words, that the Germans would restore the Ukraine, would restore Belarus. And this has much to do when you're looking at the Russian Revolution. These countries, the Baltic Republic, Belarus, and the Ukraine, were latecomers. They were integrated into the Soviet Union between the 1920s and 1930s. So there was very strong national roots here. And these are some of the few pictures that we have. What you see is, of course, you see by the helmets, these are German soldiers coming into a Ukrainian village and being greeted by, there's even one that does the Hitler salute right here, another one over here, greeted by the Ukrainians as liberators. Yet they very quickly realized that the Germans had no such intention. They didn't want to return their country, and they treated Ukrainians much like they treated Russians, much like they treated Belarusian. They treated them bad, poorly. This goes back to the lecture I gave earlier, where basically the Germans saw themselves extracting resources and using the labor of the people. Nothing more. Certainly not. It was only later in the war, and I'm going to talk about this, that the Germans would make promises. Promises to the Ukraine, promises to the Belarus. So they would create units that would fight side by side with the German armed forces against the Red Army. What happened to these units after the war is no big mystery. If those individuals were captured, they were shot. There were even very few units, and that's a sad story. You see that a little bit in the movie, is it not Conspiracy? Defiance, the one with Daniel Craig. You see that a little bit, that sometimes you have partisans who are neither part of the Red Army nor are they part of the Germans, but they're fighting on their own. And these units were hunted by Germans and by the Red Army. And they were, towards the end of the war, pretty much wiped out. A very sad episode. And that's why The Bloodlands is such a fascinating book, because it talks about all of this, the different national ambitions that weren't really met. You have Nazi Germany, you have the Soviet Union on the other hand, and these countries literally being squeezed out of the human blood, out of the human potential that they have. And what this leads to is, of course, very much disappointment by these people. And ultimately, you will see these people that did the Hitler salute joining partisan groups and fighting against the Germans. And what you will see also, and that's the scariest of them all, is that the spiral of violence on both sides will get out of control. But the Germans will retaliate against partisans. These are civilians taking out arms by shooting them. If you don't find the culprits, you basically randomly select hostages that you will execute, and this will become more and more oppressive. How important are partisans? We often talk about the French resistance, we talk about the Italian resistance. Let me give you one example. When the Soviets, and the date is interesting, when the Soviets launched their major offensive on June 22nd, 1944, why the Soviets picked that date is obvious. You know, basically, you Germans picked June 24th, we're going to do it similarly. The German rear was interrupted in 10,000 different spots. That's how many partisans were active behind German lines. 10,000 spots. In other words, they blew up railway lines, they blocked roads, they did all kinds of things. Because it's estimated that, I mean, again, we don't know exactly, but it's estimated that about, for all the Red Army that was fighting the Germans up front, there were several 100,000 partisans active in the German rear. So the Germans actually had to have special detachments just hunting down these individuals. And these detachments, that was Dirlewanger, the guy you had up there, that really nasty Nazi. These were given to extremely nasty individuals who would use tactics that, kill babies, just terrible things. So again, this is what I spoke about earlier. Some historians see this as a lost opportunity. The Germans initially would have reached out a hand to some of these populations, but again, it will probably just prolong the war, and make things just worse. So in many ways, the terrible treatments of the Germans of this civilian population in many ways led to a shorter war. Here a couple of propaganda posters. You sometimes wonder how efficient was how effective, I should say, effective and efficient was the German propaganda? Not very. I mean, it was efficient in the sense that they got people to join the German side by prisoner-wise. But most of the propaganda that had aimed at the civilian population was all about demonstration of might. This is a good example. Basically reads in Russian here, if you don't say what we want to do, we're going to crush you. We got the tanks, we got the weapons. And this is a happier poster, which basically shows that the Germans were marching forward and they're supported by the peasant population that feeds them. And supposedly, again here, the notion is that the Germans will defend these peasants and the peasants will give the food to the Germans. So somewhat effective, but not so much. I mean, these guys very quickly figured out that the Germans weren't nice individuals who were respecting their rights and ultimately addressing their sort of political view. The reality, and this is something that I already mentioned on Tuesday. The reality is something that this is one of these plans that always makes me shudder. In order to create living space in the East, what did the Germans plan? What did they have planned? And we do have a few blueprints. The best one of these blueprints is the so-called Generalplan Ost. This means General Plan East. A nice code name. What to do with the East. It was issued in April of 1942. It was drafted by the SS for Heinrich Himmler. And this is what the plan said. And this shows again, comes back to the question that the gentleman up there asked earlier. This shows what were some of the major areas that the Germans envisioned for settlement. The Baltic Republic and some of the Belarus, because these are extremely fertile regions for resettlement. And the other region, of course, that was envisioned for settlement was the Crimean Peninsula and a big chunk of the Ukraine. So, but what do you do with the population that lives there? After all, especially the section of the Soviet Union that's closest to Germany and closest to Europe, you do have a sizable population. Again, the population is dispersed. Most of the Soviet Union at this point is still very much agricultural land. You do have some cities. You have growth of cities such as Minsk, Kiev, Moscow, but you still have a sizable population. And here's the scary part of General Plan East. What do you do with it? Well, you estimate about 45 million people to live in this area. Of these 45 million people, you displace, and I mentioned displace, 31. I mean, displace is not really elaborated on. It's a term. It's a term that basically could mean that you're displacing these people beyond the area, in the area that you're not so much interested in another area of the Soviet Union, and you can create a puppet state or something like this. But displace could also mean that you systematically starve this population to death, you single them out for extermination. Of the 14 million people that are left, and these are populations that could be Germanized. In other words, you go into this population, you're looking for individuals who have the traits that you value, blonde, tall, blue-eyed. You're taking these individuals out and you Germanize them. If they're children, you give them to an SS couple that cannot have children on their own, as an example. If they are women, you put them in one of these Lebensborn, in one of these fountain of life institutions to basically become breeders for the new generation of Germans. So, in other words, you're taking away about 2/3 of the population, more than 2/3 of the population of what is left. These will be turned into Germans, and then, of course, you have all these expenses that are now denuded, they're empty of people. You're bringing in Germans, and since the Germans, you probably don't have enough Germans that will settle there, you also take people who are almost like Germans, like the Dutch, the Danish, the Norwegians, and also the Flemish population, the Dutch-speaking population of Belgium. And you're taking there and you resettle them there. Then you will make sure that all of this area remain under control. Remember, Hitler's main notion was we don't want these places to develop their own identity. So you have what are known as central places, from where you have SS divisions controlling all of this new living space. So this would be essentially a police state. A police state that is based on genocide. Scary when you think about it. Now, why did Generalplan East? Well, it was devised but never executed, and that has, of course, a lot to do with what happens on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1941-1942. Let me just say a few things. I mean, as we've seen earlier from the documentary and from what I said, the initial campaign is very successful. The Germans have tremendous victories in June, July, August, September, and then the campaign moves into October. You still, the Germans have all these magnificent battles that they fight, and they're taking millions and millions of prisoners, but they never quite have the battle that knocks the Soviet Union out of the conflict. So what you have is that the Soviet soldiers withdraw deeper and deeper into their territory, and that's when the Germans, by about September, October, realized that the Soviet Union is not as advanced as countries like France, for instance. When you move away from the borders, you will find that the roads, the Russian roads, are not paved, but they're really dirt roads. The other thing that Stalin did, and this is something that Franco also did in Spain, is he have a different gauge of railway, because you want to make sure that the German railways will not work right away. So the Germans literally, for every mile that they conquered, they had to replace the entire railway. And that's, of course, a major investment in infrastructure. So Stalin had already planned this. All of these paranoid leaders, whether it's Franco or Stalin, they realized you change the gauge on your railway so the enemy cannot use your railway system right away. And that, of course, will prevent, and Dr. Norris will show you, he will show you some pictures that the Germans, in order to bring supplies up to the Eastern Front, still used horse-drawn carriages. Because that was the most effective transport there. And that's slow, cumbersome, but what will happen in October of 1941 is that the rains set in. This is continental climate. So you have tremendous rains that pour down. And the first thing that happens when the rain pours down on the roads, the dirt roads, in the Soviet Union, it will turn them into mud. So all of your vehicles, whether they're tanks, whether they're trucks, they will get stuck. So, you know, you have to pull them out. It's a cumbersome process. So your whole campaign after October of 1941 will essentially get stuck in a mud. October is not a good month. Of course, the Germans use this to kind of bring up more supplies, give a rest to their soldiers, so that it has a certain advantage, but it also allows the Soviets to withdraw deeper and deeper into the Soviet Union, to regroup, to bring in fresh forces, especially from other regions of the Soviet Union that are not under attack. And then November comes. And November, it already gets cold. Continental climate. I said, I don't know how many of you in California were spoiled with climate, especially all you have to do is drive from here to Bakersfield and you see the difference. I mean, all you have to do today is just drive from Camarillo to Ojai and you see the difference. That's 20, 25 degrees. And this is continental climate. Because continental climate means that the oceans or the seas don't really influence the climate. The reason why we have such a relatively benign climate outside is because you got the big Pacific Ocean. You don't have that much. So you have extreme temperatures. Extremely hot in the summer, extremely cold in the winter. So what happens in November is that the first freeze sets in, which initially is great for the Germans because all these muddy roads freeze over, become solid, and once again, the offensive goes forward. You know, initially it's great. Hey, yes, roads are frozen, we can move forward. And the German war machine moves up again. But then, of course, as we move from November into December, temperatures start dropping. Initial freeze is 32 degrees, we know this, right? 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius. In Germany, we use Celsius. Sometimes the conversion, I have to keep both of them in mind. 32 degrees Celsius, but then the temperature starts dropping into the 20s, into the teens, 0 Fahrenheit. Minus 10, minus 20, minus 30. And here you may ask yourself, you know, Dr. Buschmann, when minus 30, are you talking about Fahrenheit or are you talking about Celsius? The interesting thing is at minus 35, Celsius and Fahrenheit meet. They're the same. It's just one word. It's damn cold. It is very cold. It's so cold, in fact, that everything freezes. So everything you use, and you know, just think of your own car. What happens to your car if you're in extreme temperatures? You use antifreeze, right, to basically keep it going. The German machinery had some of these built in, but they weren't used to these kind of temperatures. So basically, everything that moves freezes, whether it's a tank, an aircraft, a truck. So, and the other thing is, and Dr. Norris is going to show you this, the German uniforms. They're beautiful, well tailored. I don't know if you saw the Germans marching, you know, everything fits perfectly. Their boots fit exactly to the feet. There's only one problem with that. When it gets this cold, you don't want to have well-fitted boots. The other thing is that most of the German boots were nailed, and you know, the soles were nailed to the boot with iron nails, extreme conductors of cold. So the result of this is frostbite. It basically hurts the machines as well as human beings. To make matters worse, this is Hitler again, you know, great commander. Hitler and his generals had foreseen that the Germans would conquer the Soviet Union within a few months, so they had not issued winter clothing to the soldiers. Many of these soldiers that were in there in December of 1941 were still wearing cotton jackets. It was only belatedly in mid-December that it was rushed there and basically collected in desperation from the civilian population to just rush it up to the front. So many of the German soldiers were freezing and many of them were dying. Many of them, if they were lucky, lost a toe or two. To make matters worse, the Soviets have finally learned. They're using some of the best adopted troops. And this, of course, is important because Stalin is in constant discussion with his spies in Japan. What is Japan going to do? And he finds out that they have planned an attack on a major US naval base. Stalin didn't care so much whether this was Honolulu or whether this was Guam or maybe San Diego. Stalin just knew they're going to strike against the US, they're not going to strike against us. So he withdraws some of his best troops, Siberian troops, from the front line in Siberia, and he throws them against the Germans. And notice that these guys, their uniforms are not perfectly tailored. They're actually well camouflaged against the background of snow. Look at the boots. Many of these boots are probably a size or two bigger. than your normal boots. And there's a reason for this, because you can stuff things inside the boots, whether it's hay, whether it's newspaper, because this stuff that you stuff in there insulates you from the cold. This is very important. You can even, if you have the resources, you can wear 2 pairs of socks. Few of these soldiers have 2 pairs of socks. Let me just say that. And then last not least, you have, for the first time, a tank that has entered the battle already since June 22nd, 1941, a tank that is a match, not just a match of the German tanks, but better than anything that the Germans have. That is the T-34. T-34. Different from the T-4. Don't get those two confused, right? The T-4 is the euthanasia program. The T-34 is the tank. So, I know many of you know a little bit about military history. What makes the T-34 such a wonderful tank?
Big cannon?
Big cannon. Excellent. Yes. Excellent. Excellent. Big, and not only it's big, it's 76 millimeters or 7.6 centimeters. It's as big as the biggest German tanks had also this armament. The problem with the German tank is it was stunted. It was short. This has a big and long cannon. That means the velocity of the projectile coming out of here will actually break through any armor that the Germans have. So excellent. Yes, big cannon.
There's also the angle of the hole, which could deflect German rounds perfectly.
Excellent. Slanted armor. Slanted armor. Notice that most of the tanks that you see have the straight armor. This is slanted armor, so when an anti-tank shot comes, it just deflects right off it. Excellent. Yes. A couple more advantages.
Since it's Russian, does it have the capabilities of antifreeze?
Right. Yes, definitely. And this is connected to something else. It's very easy. I mean, the Germans, when they first took over these tanks, they walked in there, and all it had is a seat and basically a stick shift that was forward and backward. Very simple technology. The Germans said, "What's this?" Because the Germans were used to, you go into your tank, you have comfortable seating, you know, you have different kind of gear shifts that go forward and backwards. But the advantage of this is, since it's so simple, the construction of it is simply done, it can be quickly and mass produced. It is estimated that up until the 1950s, about 60 to 70,000 of these tanks were produced. If you compare this to the productions of German tanks, they are nowhere near this. And I'll show you some of the other tanks that the Germans would produce to match this particular tank. So absolutely, technology, easy, can be mass produced, especially during the siege of Stalingrad. We have tanks pulled off the assembly line, brought right to the front line without even paint. You know, just throw them up, take them up, take them out. The armament is quite stupendous. You also have a fairly effective machine gun, but that's pretty much it. A crew of 4, which is not a very big crew, that could operate this. And here's another thing, the track. It's a wide track. It's wider than the German tanks. And why is that? Well, it doesn't get stuck in the mud. It goes to very difficult terrain. So this was a perfect tank. The problem, I mean, the Red Army had this since the very beginning of the campaign. But because of the purges, because the crews weren't well trained, many of these tanks were not used very effectively. They often just used one of these tanks. But the major winter offensive that the Russians did, and this occurs, is interesting, on December 5th, 1941, 2 days before Pearl Harbor. That's when they used many of these tanks, much like the Germans had used. They used blitzkrieg against the Germans. lightning war against the Germans, used these experienced troops who could fight in the winter, and the unthinkable, I'm saying from a German perspective, happened. The German army was not just stopped in their tracks, but many of these Soviet tanks and soldiers broke through German lines. Defeat was imminent. Hitler was shocked. How could this happen? Of course, Hitler blamed it all on what he called general winter. The Russian winter itself was the best general that the Russians had. He couldn't foresee that the Russians had good generals, the Russians had good soldiers, the Russians had good technology. He didn't want to hear about this. So everything is because of the environment. Everything is because of the weather. So Germany was on the brink of defeat. So what do? Iron discipline. So of course, what do you basically deal with this? On one hand, you hire and fire generals. You basically promote generals that are ruthless, that stand their ground, that will help the soldiers stand their ground, and you reward the soldiers with medals. There was a question already about, what kind of medals do you use? You have particular medals, and we know that Germany had a flood of medals, but you had special medals just for the Eastern Campaign. The first one was a medal given to every single soldier that survived the winter of 1941 and 1942. It was this one. It was called the Battle in the East, the Winter Battle in the East, and you can imagine that the soldiers who got this gave it a particular nickname, the Freezer Medal, for obvious reasons. I bought this one in Barcelona a long time ago, and I believe that this was actually given to a Spaniard of the Blue Division, who probably looked at this and said, really, I could be in beautiful Spain, I could be in the Mediterranean, and here I am, in the middle of the Russian winter. A couple of other medals. And these are actually not medals, these are what we would call shields, because these are shields that are given to you for a particular campaign. And the reason why these are called shields is because you wear them on the side of your uniform. And there are two. I'm going to pass around here a little bit. Basically, I talked about how the Germans surrounded Russian soldiers and created these pockets. During the winter of 1941, 1942, as the Russians were breaking through, as the Red Army was breaking through, they were creating pockets of German soldiers. One of these pockets was around the city of Cholm, and it shows an eagle and an iron cross. I'm going to pass this around. By the way, if you think that, don't put this in your pocket, I would like these back. And if you think that these are probably not authentic. I kind of bought them in the flea market, but just to give you an impression, there are only 8,000 giving out of them, and an original of these runs somewhere between $8,000 to $10,000. So I don't think this is original. This one is definitely not original because, that's a fake. I'm pretty sure. This one is another battle. This is the Battle of Demyansk. I actually recently interviewed, about 2 years ago, a German soldier that fought here. And Demyansk was a bigger pocket. And this one was a pocket that was supplied from the air. So the Germans basically flew over the pocket and dropped via airdrops supplies, and that's why you have an airplane on here. Because this was a medal, a shield, not just given to soldiers fighting there, but also pilots who were involved in the airdrop. So I'm going to pass these around. Again, I think this one is original, because I bought this in Barcelona. It looks kind of worn. The other two are not. So if they fall out, which sometimes happen, don't worry about it. Pass this around. I have another shield, and this one is original. There we go. First one already. Don't worry about it. This one is from the Battle of Crimea. This actually dates not to the winter of 1941, 1942, but this dates to 1943, 1944. They had several of these shields made. There was also, the most famous one is the Narvik shield, which basically was given to German soldiers fighting in Norway, in the Arctic of Norway. So I'll pass this around as well. That one I think is original, because it's somewhat corroded. But there's so many fakes out there that somebody may have just based this in acid. So everything is possible. So that's just an example of how the Germans tried to stop the front at all odds, try to convince the population that everything is well. And what the reversal on the Eastern Front really did is it really marked the people back home, because this is something that you cannot keep secret, because soldiers of course send postcards home. If you censor every single postcard, then the civilian population wants to know what's going on. So the Nazis actually had to do something about this. And we'll talk about this. What the Nazis would do is what they call a limited truth campaign. Not all the truth, limited truth campaign. So, and again, the Nazis learned their lessons from 1914, 1918. Right? They learned their lessons from World War I. They don't want to repeat this. Because when the morality of the population back home is eroded, that's actually a bad thing. So here's the interesting thing that we don't often consider, but once the German army was successful in France, Hitler decided to lower armament production, to shift production into more luxury goods, and partially to win the hearts of the German people. And it's interesting that German armament was still relatively low until the end of 1941, when the German army was stopped on the outskirts of Moscow. It is only in January of 1942 that Hitler appointed a new architect of armament, none other than, of course, Albert Speer, who was also the architect of many other buildings in Berlin. And Hitler basically told Albert Speer, you have to bring armament levels up again. And it's interesting, it's not until the summer of 1942 that German armament is back to 1940 levels. Again, if you're carrying such an important battle as the East, this is a major miscalculation. Of course, these are posters that you would see in Germany, front and the homeland, securing victory. So you basically have the workers, and you of course have the soldiers. Basically, that's why we use the term the home front, because the home front is just as important as the Eastern Front, the Western Front. Goebbels. Goebbels comes in. My favorite, Goebbels. Yes, favorite in quotation marks. The Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment. He will move forward. He will tell the people. He will be the ones doing the fiery speeches. It's no longer Hitler. I talked about this, how Hitler's star is slowly descending, and this is Goebbels. This is Goebbels who makes most of the major speeches following 1941. But there was a question.
Yeah, I was just real quick, because I know, wasn't the Battle of the Bulge very in favor of the Germans, and it was still very harsh?
Battle of the Bulge in 1944.
And then, so I'm just wondering, like, they were just so unsuccessful in the Eastern Front, but then in like the Battle of the Bulge, it seemed like they were very, like the Germans were very successful.
I'm not sure about what we call the Battle of the Bulge successful, because one of the major things, and I'll talk about it when I talk about the Battle of the Bulge, is that all of the tanks, all of the German tanks only had half a tank of gas. And one of the major objectives of the Battle of the Bulge was ultimately to reach Antwerp, which was the major port that supplied the Allies. But one of the major objectives was to basically get to the fuel supplies, American fuel supply. So it shows a sort of desperation at this point. And was it successful? No. The major tank battle, and I will talk a little bit about that, will occur actually in the summer of 1943. That is the Battle of Kursk. That one by itself is an interesting thing. We'll get to that in a second. So Goebbels is concerned because obviously he has his ear on the ground. He's got a lot of spies among the German population. He finds out that the German mood is low. He has to do something about this. He has to bring it up. So he goes on what is called a limited truth campaign. It's almost like 1984. It's like double speak, right? It's truth, but not quite. So it's a sort of double speak. And he basically says, yeah, things are going bad in the East. We've seen the German soldiers stop, but should we now give up? Should we not support the German soldier fighting out there? And he basically said, remember what happened in World War I. We gave up too early. We signed the armistice on November 11th, 1918, and we basically stabbed the victorious army in the back. Should we repeat this now? Isn't not now the time that we basically have to move forward to support the soldier that is suffering there on the Eastern Front, donate our clothing, donate our money, donate our faith? And the German people actually react very positively to this. They say, look at this, he's actually telling us the truth. He really wasn't telling all the truth, limited truth, but the German people were reacting rather positive to this. And as I mentioned earlier, Goebbels will make more appearance than Hitler will do. Of course, what's helping Goebbels is that since the 1930s, the Nazis have been popularizing the radio. And the radio ended up in virtually every single household. If you didn't have enough money to purchase a radio, the party would give you one. So all of the speeches by Goebbels, all of the speeches by Hitler would come directly to your living room. I mean, the radio really was what, up until recently, the TV was. Now you have a TV in every room, but up until recently you had a single TV in the living room. So the radio was that. I mean, we saw, Dr. Volkens showed us that the Nazis were experimenting with TV, but the technology wasn't there to give a TV to every single household. I don't know who was first.
How quickly did Goebbels respond with this limited truth campaign?
Very quickly.
Because the Russians started on December 5th. Right?
Yes,
So how
very
soon
quickly.
after that?
He basically started to get on the radio in December because the news came out. He already told newsreels were very depicting the trouble that was going there. But again, it's a limited truth campaign because the newsreels are not talking about the superiority of the Russian tank. They're talking about the dismal conditions that the soldiers are over there. That the only reason why the German troops were stopped, and again, it was called a stop, not a defeat, was because of the conditions, the weather conditions that were there, not because of the Russians. And again, Goebbels would say, I am confident that come spring, we're on the march again. And all of this, of course, comes over the airwaves. There's also a dark side to this because some people started listening now to foreign news. Because by 1941, 1942, Radio London was powerful enough to send signals over into Germany. Same with Radio Moscow, who basically had German broadcasts from these stations informing the people of what was really happening out there. But if you were to listen to these foreign broadcasts, this is what the poster says, you would be a traitor, Verräter, which in German means traitor. You're betraying the cause. And many people who listen to foreign radio emissions were given very stiff prison sentences. If you were a repeat offender, especially towards the end of the war, you would be executed.
How did they find out you were listening to them?
Neighbors. Always your nice neighbors. And sometimes the case is that you weren't really listening to it. You just had some sort of conflict with the neighbors. The neighbor would call the Gestapo office and say, the guy over there, he's not really listening to Goebbels. I heard Radio Moscow. And you could say, well, how did you know it was Radio Moscow? Because the broadcast was in German. Oh, I knew because. So in many ways, you actually it wasn't necessarily tied to the truth. It was somebody denouncing it. Here's a good example of why the radio became so popular. These are low-income Germans who are basically given free radios by the party. The Nazi party themselves was having these rallies, giving individuals these radios so they could have one for themselves. Again, it was one per household, so you didn't have a radio in every room. This was one per household. Generally in the living room, you would have this radio right there.
Did you have to have a radio? Did you have to have a radio?
You didn't have to have a radio. It wasn't, no.
Because there must have been Germans that were still against the
Yeah, there was peer
Nazis,
pressure.
I would figure that they didn't want to have a radio.
Yeah, well, the notion was, well, again, to talk about Dr. Cordero, if somebody would, if a Nazi official would walk in your living room and would say, how come you don't have a radio? And they would say, oh, we can't afford it. Oh, we got a program here. We can get this to you. And if you would say, we don't want it, there's nothing on the radio, they would say, well, what kind of German are you? You're not listening to the speeches of Goebbels, you're not listening. And in this dire hour where our soldiers are suffering on the Eastern Front, you are not being patriotic. So a lot of groupthink and peer pressure that would affect that you would get a radio. This other image here is Goebbels testing out one of the newer ones, and this is my favorite. Because the German people started to nickname, because Goebbels gave so many speeches on the radio, that they started to nickname the radio Goebbels Snout. German Goebbels Schnauze. Yap, 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 yap. Because that's basically what you hear when you turn on the radio. So, and I'll show you some of the effectiveness. The other thing that you have, not only the radio, but you also have these newsreels, and I've showed you some examples of this already. You have a new edition of Newsreels every 2 weeks. It's called die Deutsche Wochenschau, which means the German weekly news. And they would screen this before the movies. I don't know, you probably are too young, but when I was growing up in Spain, Franco was still alive, and I went to the movies, they still had stuff like this. Because in the 70s, Spain, not many people had TVs, so the only thing you could get, and that was propaganda too, because obviously Franco was a dictator. The only way you could get this out is when people went to the movies and they watched these. So this was a very effective tool into the 70s and even the 80s.
Was Goebbels' speeches censored, or did they kind of just let him? Did Hitler kind of oversee him a little bit, or did they kind of just say?
I think he had faith in him. I don't think Hitler censored Goebbels' speeches. I mean, Goebbels censored himself in many ways, and he was quite. I mean, he was a writer. He wrote novels, so I think he had some ability. Did he plagiarize? Probably. Yeah. So, but I don't think. I mean, yeah, I'm. Somebody could correct me. I don't think that Hitler censored Goebbels. I'm not aware of him doing something like this. Because he had trusted Goebbels, and there was this sort of mutual trust. If you see the movie Downfall, it goes until the very end. Because Goebbels is the one that, well, if Hitler stays in Berlin, I'm going to. Goebbels sacrifices his entire family, I mean, really his wife, the entire family to Hitler. So there's a certain trust there. When everybody betrays Hitler, Goebbels is the last one to stay. Because Himmler betrays Hitler, Goering betrays Hitler at the end. Goebbels doesn't. So there's that trust. An interesting thing also, I should say, of course the newsreels are filled with Nazi propaganda. You already saw this. But when you're looking at actual films produced after 1942 in Nazi Germany, they're not films about the war. They're mostly, I mean, there are exceptions, and I'll get to that, but they're mostly films about love. They are lighthearted comedies. They are films that will lead people to escape the harsh reality that they're facing. Because this is the time, of course, also that the bombardments over German skies will go on the increase. So people see the war around them. They hear about the war. They don't want to see the war in the cinema. Okay. So most of the movies that date to about 1942, 1943, 1941, and even into 1944 will not be movies dealing with the situation at hand. I'm going to show you some of them later. Springtime. I shouldn't say springtime because it's that silly song, right? Springtime for Hitler in Germany. But springtime 1942 occurs, and the Germans once again go on the offensive in the Soviet Union. The offensive is done with words, as we have seen. Goebbels is basically sending words out there, propaganda out there that comes to your living room, that comes to your movie theater. But it's also done with new types of technology. The best example of this is a new kind of tank that the Germans will introduce. It's known as the Tiger tank. And again, if you want to know more detail about this, Dr. Norris has a whole section dedicated to German tanks, more than you ever wanted to know. But let me just say a few things about how the Tiger tank is an answer to the T-34. First off, the T-34 has a long cannon. So does the Tiger tank. The T-34 has a 76 millimeter cannon. This cannon that the Tiger has is 88 millimeter, 8.8 centimeters. And it's actually borrowed, I don't know, anybody here get military history? Where do the Germans get the idea of using this particular cannon from?
Just a regular artillery?
Not artillery. The idea of it is an artillery piece, but it's done for a particular purpose. Anti-aircraft guns. The German 8.8 is probably the most famous anti-aircraft gun the Germans use. And German gunners, during the Russian campaign, when they were facing a T-34, became very frustrated in trying to take those tanks out. The anti-tank guns didn't really help. They bounced off because of the slanted armor. But they realized when they used the anti-aircraft cannon and aimed it, instead of putting it up in the air, but aimed it horizontally at the T-34, the initial velocity of these because they have to have a great velocity to shoot them in the air, the initial velocity of this anti-aircraft gun would penetrate the armor of the T-34. So consequently, they used this particular design on the new Tiger tank. What you're looking at, however, is also again one of these German marvels of technology. Beautiful seats, great technology inside. It's almost like, think of it as the Lamborghini of tanks. The problem with this is it was so highly, how should I put it? So much was invested in this tank that it frequently broke down. Because it was so complex, the technology was so complex that it was a great tank, once you got it moving, it was very difficult to penetrate. It had over 1 inch of armor, several inches, as a matter of fact, of armor. So it had, again, it copied some of the T-34, it had broad tracks. 50 tons, it's a giant. The consumption of this tank, in order to move it, and I might be exaggerating here, I'm trying to get this from memory, but in order to move this tank 1 mile, you needed in excess of a gallon. So think of this as the Hummer of all German tanks. Not very fuel efficient. And as a matter of fact, this was the slower model of the tank. That was 58 tons. The Germans would build one, they call it the King Tiger, 68 tons. You can think of what the oil consumption of that particular tank was. Especially, it already shows the Achilles heel of the German army, and that was fuel supply. And this already shows where the offensive went. Operation Blue. Notice that no longer Operation Barbarossa. That's out. And that was stopped in December of 1941. So a new operation is brought in, Operation Blue. Why a color? Well, we used the color In the Netherlands, we used the color in the offensive against France. We called it Operation Yellow. It went wonderfully. Why not use the color blue? And instead of, and this is something that you noticed, let me show you the front in the east. Initially, the Germans attacked on a very broad front, right? Ranging from Finland all the way to the Black Sea. Operation Blue concentrated only on the southern region. It had two strategic objectives. The first one was the Caucasus Mountains, located right over here. Why the Caucasus Mountains?
Always run out of white people.
Yes. Yeah, there was some of that. There was definitely some of that. But notice that the Caucasus is located very close to Iran and Iraq. Oil. The Caucasus Mountain was a major supply of oil. You needed that oil just to propel all these gigantic tanks and to keep the German machinery going. The other objective was the city of Stalingrad. Why Stalingrad? Two reasons why Stalingrad will be in the crosshair of the Germans.
Production center.
It was a major production, make it three objectives, a major production center, yes, absolutely, a major city.
It was the namesake of Stalin, and he just wanted to piss him off.
Yes, you want to take out Stalin's city. I mean, you think that's silly. But Hitler thought, you know, if you take out Stalin's city, then that will be some sort of symbolic action, absolutely. You're taking out Stalin's city. And the second objective is, and that's kind of harder to see, is a city located along the Volga River. And the Red Army was using the Volga River as a major supply line. Okay, that's why Stalingrad became such an important objective. So basically it says here, capture outfields located in the Caucasus, eradicate the Volga lifeline, so the capture of Stalingrad. And here you see propaganda again, effective. Because as you move into the Caucasus Mountains, you have some of the highest mountains in Europe. This is Mount Elbrus, E-L-B-R-U-S, Elbrus. And on top of this mountain, you see Nazi mountaineers who basically climb to the highest mountain. Again, this is something that you can put in newspapers, you can put in newsreels, you can show the effectiveness of the German soldier. It cannot be stopped, regardless what you throw at them. So after initial successive plan fails, but propaganda still makes use of the greatest Nazi expansion. So when we move into 1942, we really have the height of Nazi expansion. In 1942, it still looked good. Initially, Plan Blue moved against the city of Stalingrad, into the Caucasus Mountains. At the same time, of course, the Germans are moving all the way to El Alamein in North Africa. So everything is looking pretty good. But things will start to slowly reverse themselves. First, in the fall of 1942, you have Montgomery and the 8th British Army defeating Rommel at El Alamein. And as Rommel withdraws, the first US troops land in North Africa. So you have boots on the ground. Not in Europe, but in the African continent. Ultimately, the Germans have to mount their last defense in Tunisia. This is fairly easily defensible. It's very narrow. It gets narrower as you move further and further. But by May of 1943, all German and Italian troops surrendered in North Africa. But turning to the Eastern Front, which is really what we're talking about. Well, the Germans initially are successful in moving into the Caucasus Mountain, but what the Soviets do wisely is to burn all the fuel supplies. You know, much of what you saw, for instance, perhaps you still remember doing Operation Desert Storm, as the US was moving into Iraq, and Saddam Hussein lit up all of the oil wells. This is something that the Soviets did too. So they basically disabled whatever fuel fell into German hands, the Soviets would disable. And ultimately, because the Caucasus Mountains, to show you again, are very rugged, very high. It's not an easy territory where you can fight. So basically, you're not really moving forward very much. So ultimately, this too comes to a stop. And then we get to Stalingrad. The Germans, by the fall of 1942, take about 90% of the city. If you ever want to see a very good movie about this, think Enemy at the Gate, a sniper movie, because this obviously also shows you a new phenomenon, the sniper becoming very important. The medals that I'm showing around initially were worn by the Germans on their chest, but that of course makes an excellent target for snipers. So the bling, as the war goes on, will slowly disappear from the German uniforms. So Stalingrad becomes a major meat grinder for both the Soviets and the Germans. And that, of course, we move to yet another Christmas of 1942. Christmas 1941 was bad. Goebbels got over it. But what do you do in the meat grinder of Stalingrad? And you see some of the images here. Stalingrad, for instance, became what the German soldier feared the most. It was almost like going back to World War I, because tanks weren't effective. The Germans bombed the city into rubble, so you couldn't really use tanks, and you had to have hand-to-hand combat, very closely related to what happened in World War I.
I was going to ask about the air campaign.
The air campaign was somewhat successful, but you can bomb Stalingrad over and over again. I mean, when you see images from Stalingrad, especially in the fall of 1942, it's just wrong.
What were the Russians? Were they up to speed with the air campaign, or were they just kind of?
Yes, they were actually producing similar aircraft than the Germans, and better ones too. So as the war moved on, the air superiority would, after about 1942, 1943, would switch over to Soviets. Give you about one example. During the campaign of June 22nd, 1944, air superiority, Russian air superiority to German was about 8-1. By the time we moved into 1941, it was probably 20-1. So it was clearly moving against this. But I want to show you something that the Germans did for propaganda purposes. The war, again, is halting in the East. Even Operation Blue is not advancing. So what do you do? How do you bring the people back home who are now sitting under the Christmas tree? They're sitting under the Christmas tree and they're wondering what's going to happen. So again, that's when the masters of propaganda come in and basically devise a Christmas broadcast that was very unique in history. A Christmas broadcast where you have a central radio station in Berlin calling onto every single front line that the Germans are in, whether it's Africa, whether it's France, whether it's the Caucasus, whether it's Stalingrad. And it's a very, very, again, there are some people who actually doubt that this ever happened. Some people actually claim that this was done in a studio. I'm not sure, but it sounds pretty authentic to me. So let's listen to this. This is December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1942.
Noch einmal sollen sich nun unter dem Eindruck dieser Stunden, die wir zusammen erlebten, alle Kameraden an den entferntesten Übertragungsstellen melden und Zeugnis ablegen durch ihren Ruf von dem umfassenden Erlebnis dieser unserer Ringsendung. Achtung, ich rufe noch einmal den Eismeerhafen Lillehammer. Achtung, ich rufe noch einmal Stalingrad.
Hier ist Stalingrad. Hier ist die Front an der Wolga.
Achtung, noch einmal die Lapplandfront.
Hier ist die Baracke im finnischen Winterwald.
Achtung, noch einmal Südfrankreich, die Luftwaffe.
Hier ist ein Feldflugplatz in Südfrankreich.
Und noch einmal die Kriegsmarine und das Heer in Südfrankreich.
Hier ist Vladivostock an der französischen Riviera.
Achtung, Achtung, noch einmal der Kampfraum um Reshef.
Hier ist die Front südwestlich Toropet von Kalinin. Der Kampfraum um Reshef.
Achtung, der Ruf noch einmal zum Golf von Biskaya.
Hier ist die Hafenstadt an der südfranzösischen Atlantikküste.
Achtung, noch einmal Leningrad.
Hier ist Front vor Leningrad und am Molchow.
Achtung, die Kanalküste.
Hier Sicherungsverbände der Kriegsmarine am Kanal.
Achtung, noch einmal die Kaukasusfront.
Hier meldet sich die Front im Kaukasus.
Achtung, die U-Boot-Fahrer im Atlantik.
Hier ist ein Unterseebootsstützpunkt am Atlantik.
Achtung, Catania.
Hier ist die Mittelmeerfront und Afrika.
Achtung, Zakopane.
Aus dem Heeresgenesungsheim in der Tatra grüßen die Verwundeten ihre Kameraden an den Fronten.
Achtung, noch einmal Kreta. Achtung, noch einmal der Schwarzmeerhafen.
Noch einmal der Schwarzmeerhafen auf der Halbinsel Schiff. Wir bitten euch, Kameraden, jetzt in das schöne, alte deutsche Weihnachtslied Stille Nacht mit einzustimmen.
Diesem spontanen Wunsch unserer Kameraden fern drunten im Süden am Schwarzmeer schließen sich nun alle Stationen an. Jetzt singen sie schon am Eismeer und in Finnland. Und jetzt singen sie im Kampfraum um Reshef. Und jetzt schalten wir dazu alle die anderen Stationen, Leningrad, Stalingrad. Und jetzt kommt dazu Frankreich, kommt dazu Catania und singt Afrika. Und nun singt alle mit uns gemeinsam in dieser Minute das alte deutsche
A very effective way of basically convincing the German people that not all is lost, that supposedly the soldiers out there in all these different fronts, situation has not changed, and by evoking this very German, I mean, we all know it's Silent Night, it's a very German but also a very universal Christmas song. I will show you different examples later how the Nazis actually came up with Christmas songs that no longer speak of Jesus, but speak more towards the aspect of what Christmas is really about. It's about solstice and other celebrations. Again, what you heard here, supposedly, there are some people who say this is fake. Okay, so let me just put that out there. But it's a remarkable thing because you're basically bringing all these people from Murmansk, the surrounding of Murmansk, Leningrad, the fighting around Reshef that is around here, Stalingrad, Caucasus front, Crete, Catania. You basically have submarines in the Atlantic Ocean. You have the people who are around the canal, and you're basically bringing it all together. This is a remarkable thing. But again, why is this all done? To have faith that all of this will ultimately lead to a better purpose. If the radio emission doesn't convince you, let me show you something else. Because if you're going to a cinema, same time period, December 1942, you would see something like this. And unfortunately, this doesn't have subtitles, but it basically talks, it doesn't have a lot of speech. So I'm going to just translate it loosely, but it will show you the visual images of how Christmas is celebrated on the front and at home. It has images about how the German soldier guards the front and the home front is, and they're really one. That they cannot be separate. That their faiths are intertwined. So let me play this for you.
In der Wüste gibt es keine Tannenbäume.
This is in North
Eine
Africa.
Proviantkiste muss hier den Weihnachtsbaum ersetzen.
Basically, it shows soldiers in North Africa making Christmas trees because they have no trees.
In der Wüste gibt es keine Tannenbäume. Eine alte Proviantkiste muss hier den Weihnachtsbaum ersetzen. Aus Konservenbüchsen werden silberne Sterne. Auch unsere Unterseeboote, die bis weit im Süden des Äquators operieren, bekommen ihren Weihnachtsgruß. Die Kameraden, die Öl und Proviant heranbringen, haben auch die Weihnachtsgeschenke mitgebracht. Und hier Festvorbereitungen im Norden der Ostfront. Bunker an der Lapplandfront. Der Backofen ist aus einem alten Benzinfass gebaut. Wie bei Muttern. Aufstieg zu den Gletscherstellungen im Hochkaukasus. Tannenbaum und Weihnachtspost werden in dieser Bergeinsamkeit mit besonderer Sehnsucht erwartet. Jede freie Stunde wird gebastelt. Überall gehen jetzt die Gedanken in die Heimat. Der Friseur hat in diesen Tagen viel zu tun. Ein Urlaubsschein, das schönste Weihnachtsgeschenk. Spielzeug für die Kinder gefallener Kameraden. Auch das Kind im Manne kommt zu seinem Recht. Kunstwerke von Soldatenhand. Die Heimat begeht im Schutze einer starken Front die 4. Kriegsweihnacht. Künstlerinnen und Künstlerfrauen packen Feldpostpäckchen. Auch die Schuljugend hilft begeistert mit, wenn unseren Frontsoldaten eine Freude gemacht werden soll. Schwestern eines Soldatenheims an der Kanalküste bereiten Weihnachtsgaben für die Ostfront. Die Jüngsten basteln eine Überraschung für den Vater im Felde. Weihnachtsvorabend in einem Lazarett. Weihnachtsabend. Die Glocken läuten das Weihnachtsfest ein. Ihr Klang bringt über Länder und Meere unseren Soldaten an allen Fronten die Grüße der Heimat.
symbol. Again, I need to emphasize that I can give you the links for this, but this is mostly posted by neo-Nazis who think that this is a wonderful, that supposedly the Germans knew how to celebrate Christmas, even in adversity. This is very skillfully done propaganda. I don't know if you see it, but you know, the sort of evoking of certain images that nothing can beat the German soldier, that they will be victorious to the very end. Did you have any questions about what you saw? Yes.
How fast was mail carriers?
Relatively fast, because you actually try to prioritize that, because you realize how important mail was for morale, both for the home front and the eastern front. So you frequently actually gave preference. You would there were special stamps, Feldpost, which means post from the field, that would carry subsidized prices, and some of the mail, if possible, would carry it via airplane. So very quickly, because people knew how important it was to get this mail back. Censorship too was there. I mean, but as I mentioned before, when you have millions of soldiers in the field, censorship becomes. I mean, if you don't let the mail through, then you have a bigger problem than dealing with the certain things that might be. What you also would do is you would have what is known as the postcard from the field, so it would only give you certain things that you could write in it. So you could write a very elaborate letter. That was done on purpose. It was very cheap to mail that, but it would keep the message short and to the point. All right, so well, we have to talk about that battle. Of course, Stalingrad, because as the Christmas message is happening, a lot of things are happening in Stalingrad. I already mentioned that the Germans had occupied almost 90% of that city by the fall of 1942. But as we move into October and November, the Soviet Red Army is actually starting to amass forces to either side of Stalingrad. And as we move into late October and early November, they will effect a pincer movement and basically surround Stalingrad. Most of the soldiers in Stalingrad are German, but there's also some Italians. There's some Romanian soldiers there as well. But it is basically the majority of the German Sixth Army, roughly 300,000 men. It could be a catastrophe, a major catastrophe. Again, even a worse catastrophe than the winter of 1941-1942. So now you move to the next winter, this could be worse. So Hitler basically says that having learned from the examples of the first winter in Russia, he basically says, let's apply this to the second winter in Russia. Since we have supplied the cut-off German units in 1941 through the air, let's do the same in 1942. The main difference, however, is that the units that were surrounded in 1941 were several thousand, perhaps several tens of thousands, but here we talk about 300,000 men. It is estimated that supplying 300,000 men that need everything, from fuel to clothing, to medicine, to food, it would require about 250 tons a day. Of course, Hitler immediately talks to Goering, who is now in charge of the German Air Force, and Goering says, no problem, I'll do that. Turns out that even on the best day, the Germans were able to supply about 75 tons. And that's using dangerous landing conditions, where often the aircraft would, of course, be under fire. And as the Red Army is moving closer and closer, they start to conquering more and more airfield. As a matter of fact, that Christmas broadcast, when this was issued, the last German airfield falls into the hands of the Soviets. There are harrowing accounts where soldiers knew that was over, basically trying to hang on to the fuselage of the last aircraft pulling out of Stalingrad. And as the plane climbs higher and higher, they ultimately fall to their death. Not many people get out. The fighting continues. After the last airfield is taken, airdrops are made, but frequently the airdrops, of course, land in the hands of the Red Army and not in the hands of the German soldiers. The pocket is further and further squeezed. And ultimately, by late January of 1943, and moving into early February of 1943, the Germans surrender. They have no other choice. The majority of the Germans perish doing this because conditions are appalling. And I shouldn't just say that they're appalling for the Germans, they're also appalling for the Red Army. And if you see the movie Enemy at the Gate, just think of the civilian population that is in there in Stalingrad and literally suffering equally. I mean, it's estimated about 90% of the civilians of Stalingrad died during this horrifying battle. So Stalingrad surrenders. That's the first major defeat of the German army. I mean, the winter of 1941-1942 was difficult. The German army was starved, but it wasn't really defeated. Here, in the winter of 1942-1943, we have a major defeat. How do you deal with that? I mean, one way of dealing with it is, of course, again, going on a limited truth campaign, because this cannot be. 300,000 men, basically, and I should say about 60,000 of these are taken prisoner. The last transport of the prisoners from Stalingrad came to Germany in the 1950s. About 5,400 of them were returned. You could say, oh, that's terrible by the Russians, but think of the conditions that the Germans put Soviet POWs under. So you see already how the violence is escalating. The Nazis basically tried to make the best of it and trying to basically show that this was a heroic death. Okay? Here you see the German soldiers supposedly fighting to the last bullet. And what you see is the Hitler Youth basically vowing undying support. Basically saying, we will support you forever. That this is some sort of heroic image. And of course then they quote, as Dr. Volkan says, they quote Shakespeare a lot, basically saying, how does the strong die? The person that has most courage only dies once, while the weakling dies many, many times. And this whole notion that you have to be strong, you have to weed out weakness. And Stalingrad also gives me the opportunity to show that propaganda was not just done by the Germans. These were leaflets that the Russians dropped on German soldiers. And these leaflets are not about surrender. These are leaflets basically making fun of the Germans. Basically, you see Adolf Hitler holding the medals that I'm passing around. And he, in the back, of course, German tombs. He basically says, German soldier, I have promised you soil, and I've promised you fame, soil and fame. Now you have both. Basically, you have a medal and about 6 feet of soil where your body is deposited.
So it's basically telling them that you're going to die.
Yes. This was propaganda aimed at, since you mentioned, propaganda on the other side. This propaganda is, of course, aimed at Soviet soldiers. Nach Osten, this is German, means towards the east. And you see the soldier basically knocking that off. And it says underneath, towards the west. We're going the other way. Now we are in charge. Now we are taking the initiative. How do you deal with that? Right? I mean, if the winter of 1941, 1942 was bad, 1942, 1943 is not looking any better. So you're trying to, bring messages of hope into movies. And one of the best movies to describe this is a movie called The Great Love, Die große Liebe. It was issued in 1942. It was a movie basically about unrequited love. This person falls in love with an aircraft pilot who is really basically married to the country, and she's very sad, but she believes that she has to be loyal to him because she has to be loyal to the cause. It's not a very good movie. You can see it on YouTube. It's actually awful. But within the movie, it's a musical. within the movie you have songs that have echoes of what's going on in Germany and what's going on the Eastern Front. Songs like Still the World Does Not Collapse. I'm going to show you that very movie in a second. And perhaps most promising is this last one, I Know a Miracle Will Happen. Sort of foreshadowing that supposedly the tide will be turned in this war. So let me show you how, I should actually say a few things about her. If you want to, if you're looking for an interesting character for your biography paper, I know it's a little late, but think Zara Leander, because she's a Swedish actress that was lured by Goebbels to become a very famous actress in Germany. She had, as you will see, a particular voice that appealed, she had a very deep voice that appealed to a lot of Germans. She also had an accent, clearly she's Swedish, but she became rich and famous. Actually, she was smart. In 1943, she left Germany. She went back to Sweden, but unfortunately for her, she could never land again. She could never continue her movie career because of the movies she had made for the Germans. So let me show you this Still the World Does Not Collapse, which is basically about love. But the message of Still the World Does Not Collapse, it can go up, it can go down, but ultimately the world does not collapse, and it has a message here. And what you see is she's performing this concert in front of German soldiers, and it seemed to have a very happy message. So let me just play it. Again, no subtitles, unfortunately, but the song is not really that good.
Aber dann gewöhnt man sich dran und man sieht es ein. Davon geht die Welt nicht unter, sieht man sie manchmal auf Grau. Einmal wird sie wieder bunter, einmal wird sie wieder himmelblau. Geht's mal drüber und mal drunter, wenn uns der Schädel aufraucht. Davon geht die Welt nicht unter, die wird ja noch gebraucht. Davon geht die Welt nicht unter, die wird ja noch gebraucht. Davon geht die Welt nicht unter, die wird sie manchmal aufraucht.
You know, the message here is still the world does not collapse. Davon geht die Welt nicht unter. And she's basically singing that it goes up and down. This will be a movie released at the same time that things are really bad in Stalingrad. And of course, the German people like this. You know, and you notice that these are subtle or not so subtle messages that are planted right there for you. The not so subtle message would follow very quickly thereafter. Namely, Goebbels is once again asked to address the German people. Because Goebbels has to explain what's going on. Goebbels has to say to the German people, we lost Stalingrad, yes. But we have to now fight harder than ever. And here's my, the scariest thing for me. The whole notion of empathy is now dead. Because look at this poster. It reads, hardened times demand hardened duties, and that's the most scariest thing, hardened hearts. In other words, compassion is out. Compassion fades. It's done. War is no longer just a war of machines, but it's a war of words and ideology. And Goebbels talks about the final victory. He says we have all these reversals, and there will be more coming in 1943. There will be the defeat in North Africa in May. There will be major defeats coming thereafter in Italy. But there's the final victory, the victory that will put us over the top. He will also suggest, and you saw this already in Zara Leander's songs, there are secret weapons. We have new weapons. With these new weapons, we can turn the tide. Dr. Norris will tell you a lot about these weapons. Rockets, jet aircrafts. So I'm not going to say too much about that. Let me give you an impression of how this looked like, because we do have, again, documentaries from Goebbels' speech. Goebbels makes it seem like he's asking the German people a simple question. Do you want total war? In other words, do you want a war now that is more total than anything that you have experienced up to the point? I want everything from you. What you will see in this excerpt is you will hear excerpts from Goebbels' diary, that he's talking about how he sees this particular event. This is from a documentary called The Goebbels Experiment. You can find that on Netflix if you're interested in seeing that. So let me show you.
5 p.m. the long-awaited rally at the Sports Palace began.
Wenn nötig, totaler und radikaler, als wir ihn uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können.
Okay, I'm going to stop here because I don't want the national anthem associated with this stuff. So, little aside here, German national anthem. This is the first stanza. We're no longer allowed to sing it. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. We're not allowed to sing the second stanza either. So if you see the German national team on the field, we're singing the third stanza, which is about freedom, democracy, and the good stuff, not the other stuff. So. Goebbels is proclaiming total war. He seemingly is asking the German people. If we believe witnesses that day, when the crowd basically is screaming, Führer, command, we follow, that's not scripted. They do this. But it's also, it's a very dark path that the Germans are being led down or leading themselves. I'm not quite sure what's happening. But it's a path basically where you do not accept minorities no more, you do not take prisoners. You basically look down upon all people, whether traitors, whether people in the neighborhood that are listening to foreign radio shows. That's bad, you know. So they have to be gone because there's one aim, and that's total victory. One aim only. And of course, when you're looking at this. When you're looking at this, you basically also you allow no alternatives, and this is something that you see more and more in Germany happening. This sort of notion that you don't have alternatives no more. This is a poster that appeared shortly after Stalingrad. Sieg means victory, when you see the mother and her child chanting, or Bolsheviks, where all the people will suffer. And you see again the subhuman coming over from the Soviet Union. And victories are done. A victory is the only solution, I should say. other solutions don't exist. You basically kill off all alternatives. And again, you just remind the German people of what happened in World War I, where the Germans stopped supposedly 5 minutes before they would have been victorious. It's not true. But you basically use the example of World War I to remind the German people over and over again, if we surrender now, then things will get much, much worse. And basically, all of these people that you're fighting out there are subhumans. They will not take mercy on you. They will enslave you, kill you, rape you, degrade you, whatever. So there is no alternative, supposedly. Interestingly enough, Omar Bartov, when I mentioned his name earlier, he wrote a very interesting book called Hitler's Army. Very controversial book, I should say, because a lot of German historians took a lot of offense to this book. But he basically says that these extremist attitudes that you see emerging from Germany now, no compassion, basically just focus on the final victory, do not focus on minorities, do not focus on individuals that you know are not reliable. These are attitudes that now are taking roots in the army as well. Omar Bartov basically said there's always the notion among Germans that the German army supposedly was apolitical. There was the SS, and I'm going to talk about this later on. The SS supposedly were the political soldiers, the Waffen-SS, the weaponized SS, if you like. But the German army supposedly was apolitical. You could also think, again, to use the terms that Dr. Codera used: moral, immoral, and amoral. That supposedly the German soldier fighting on the Eastern Front was amoral. They had a job to do. They had to fight. Yes, they were killing, but that was their job. But Omar Bartov actually makes the case that no, the German soldier was not apolitical, was not amoral. As a matter of fact, what followed after Stalingrad was something that had completely transformed the mind of the German soldier. And the transformation is something that I find, I can follow this. You know, there's sometimes things, when Dr. Volkan talks about pretzel logic and some arguments, but this one I can follow. Because basically, one of the things that makes a lot of sense to me is for the German soldier, Stalingrad was a shock. Why? Because it was what he calls a demodernization of the Eastern Front. Initially, when the Germans were fighting between 1939 and 1941, it was modern warfare. There were planes, there were tanks. You would just mow forward, you would defeat the enemy several weeks, but all of a sudden you moved to Stalingrad. It's a demodernization of warfare because you return to trenches, you return to hand-to-hand combat. You return to what was before, almost like you stuck again in the trenches of World War I. It's a shock. It's a tremendous shock. And then as this is happening, of course, the casualty rates go up because Stalingrad becomes a meat grinder on both sides. German Red Army, lots of casualties. And Omar Bartov talks about the destruction of the primary group. And what he means by the primary group, if you were a young recruit and you brought into the army, you generally have individuals who have been in the army and who will take you under the wing. That's called the primary group. They will tell you, you just follow me, I will show you around. But with these high casualty rates, those experienced soldiers are dying off. And you left with individuals who were Hitler Youth, who have been brought up under the Nazi regime, who have seen no other thing as the Nazi regime, who heavily indoctrinated with the propaganda that we have seen here, and who also very much suffer by, again, to come back to something that Dr. Codera said, the distortion of reality, the groupthink. That's basically what you saw in the video I showed you earlier. Where unscripted individuals would raise their right hand and say, Führer, we will follow, no matter what it takes. That's groupthink. That's complete distortion of reality. But you're no longer letting any sort of reality sink in. And the last issue that Omar Bartok talks about is the perversion of discipline. That soldiers are disciplined for even minor offenses. Because what you see happening on the Eastern Front is self-inflicted wounds. The soldiers on the Eastern Front want to get out. So what would you do? You shoot yourself in the foot. You shoot yourself maybe in a hand, somewhere where they can save you, and you get sent home. But of course, doctors realize very quickly that the bullet that you have in your hand and in your foot is a German bullet. But there's powder residue near it, that you probably have done it from a low distance. If that's the case, then your case, of course, will be brought to court-martial, and in many cases you will be shot to death. Executions within the German army would go on the increase against their own soldiers, I should say, would go on the increase after the year of 1943. And what you create here is basically an army, that's what Omar Bartok maintained, an army of individuals who have no empathy, an army of what's his name? Hitler willing executioner. Goldhagen. Daniel Goldhagen would say Hitler's willing executioners. An army of assassins. A scary thought, very scary thought, but one that is also brought home to me in this movie Generation War. And I'm going to show you just a little excerpt from this particular series. You can see it on Netflix if you haven't. I highly encourage you, because it's a very open German testimony to deal with the issues of World War II. And you see two brothers. The older brother, who's basically losing faith in the war. He's leading this detachment of soldiers in a ridiculous street battle during the Battle of Kursk. And his younger brother, who was always a coward, is becoming this individual who has absolutely no morals, this individual who's becoming a willing executioner. And it's a scary moment, because it shows that within the German army, morality no longer matters. And I'm going to play this for you.
Und die Luftwaffe hat nicht mehr genug Treibstoff für Luftunterstützung.
Wir brauchen hier unbedingt Verstärkung.
Tut mir leid.
Dann haben wir keine Chance, Kurs zu erreichen.
Sie sollen bis zum Morgen ruhen. Aber Ihr Auftrag lautet weiterhin, die Telegrafenstation unbedingt einnehmen und halten.
Ganz Sizilien wird aufgegeben und meine Männer werden in die Straße geholfen!
Ablöse.
Du hattest recht. Er bringt nur das Schlechteste in uns hervor.
Ja, ich weiß. Aber das ändert nichts daran, dass wir morgen wieder da rausgehen und kämpfen.
Bis niemand mehr übrig ist.
Genau. Bis niemand mehr übrig ist. Wie viele sind gefallen in den 2 Jahren, die wir kannten? Hm? Schneider, Dorgalow, Werbinski, Bertok. Einfach so. Hör auf! Es wird erst aufhören, wenn es zu Ende ist. Hast du das noch nicht begriffen? Wir sind menschliches Vieh für die großen Schlachthöfe. Heute sind wir Helden, morgen sind wir Schweine.
Das macht doch keinen Sinn!
Es gibt keinen Sinn! Gott hat uns verlassen! Es gibt nur uns! Kein scheiß General, kein Führer. Nur uns, diese Männer da draußen. Und wenn wir morgen rausgehen und verrecken, gut, dann soll das so sein. Aber du wirst uns führen, das erwarte ich von dir.
A crucial segment, and I can't show the whole thing, it's long, but to cut a long story short, the older brother will desert, or will try to desert, while the younger brother will ultimately become a sociopath. He will basically pull the trigger whenever it's needed. I mean, when somebody says, there is no sense, God has abandoned us, that pretty much means that you have no more moral compass. You don't need to be necessarily a deeply religious person, but you have to have some values that you believe in. If this is gone, then that's something that is a very dangerous situation, and a situation within which, of course, you have the development of the Holocaust, the development of euthanasia, and also developments that you will see how the Eastern Front and all this brutality that the Germans have practiced is now turning westward. Because as the war goes bad, and you've seen this, the Allies land in Sicily in the summer of 1943. I mean, bad, of course, from the perspective of the Germans. I shouldn't say bad, this is no value judgment, please don't misunderstand me. But it basically means that you have civilians rising up against the Germans. After 1943, you have a lot more partisans taking up arms and fighting against the Germans. This happens already in the summer of 1942 when Reinhard Heydrich, and you will see this individual, is basically killed by Czech partisans who were flown in by the Royal Air Force, and they blow him up. He doesn't die right away, but he succumbs to infection. After this happens, the Germans round up, they randomly select a village in what is today the Czech Republic, kill all the men in the village, and the women and children are just dispersed, many of them taken to concentration camps. It gets worse. I mean, the Germans here again, you know, this whole notion that total victory is all about not having compassion. This is a poster that comes from Italy. What happens in Italy? The Allies land in Sicily in the summer of 1943. After that, they very quickly push up the Italian boot, the Italian peninsula. It looks a little bit like a boot, Sicily being the ball that the boot is kicking. So, but the Germans invade Italy. Italy split into two. Mussolini is initially arrested, but the Germans liberate him. They set up a puppet regime for Mussolini, and you have basically an Italy that fights against, a fascist Italy that fights against free Italy. So you have a civil war. And wherever the Germans are in control, these are the posters that come up. The Iron Fist. What a better image can you have with no compassion? Basically, reads bandits and rebels. Bandits and rebels. This will be your end. In other words, if you take up arms against the Germans, you'll be crushed by an iron fist. I mean, they're not even trying to embellish this. They're not trying to make this hide what it is. So the brutality that you've seen here developing is now sweeping westwards. The other example, of course, is the village in France called Orandour-sur-Glande. I've been there. It's a village where an SS division comes in, suspects, this was shortly after D-Day, shortly after June 6, 1944. They suspect that the village is harboring some French resistance fighters, so they round up everybody, put them in a church, and then set this church on fire. Very few people escape. A massacre. For no reason. For no reason than it needed to be done.